Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. The moment I stepped into the Cecil Hotel, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale carpet and something metallic. The staff barely looked at me when I checked in, sliding the key across the counter without a word. As I made my way to the elevator, the doors creaked open as if reluctant to let me in. My room was on one of the upper floors, far from the bustle of the street below. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. A single flickering light overhead buzzed softly, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I unlocked my door quickly, eager to shut out the eerie atmosphere outside. Inside, the room was small and sparsely furnished, the air stale and heavy. The bedspread looked like it hadn't been washed in years, and the old television sat on a dusty wooden stand. I dropped my bag on the chair and went to the bathroom, turning on the sink. The water sputtered at first, then came out in a slow, murky trickle. I let it run, hoping it would clear up, but the color remained off, tinged with a strange reddish-brown hue. I grimaced and turned it off, deciding I'd get a bottled water instead. My unease grew as I recalled the hotel's dark history, the stories of deaths and disappearances that clung to its name. I tried to shake the feeling and settled into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. A loud clanking sound jolted me awake in the middle of the night. It was coming from above, a rhythmic thudding that echoed through the ceiling. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, unsure if it was footsteps or something else. The sound continued for a few more minutes before stopping abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to check the rooftop in the morning. I had read about the infamous water tank, the source of a chilling mystery that still haunted the hotel. Pushing down my apprehension, I made my way to the stairwell and climbed up, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. The closer I got, the stronger the metallic scent became. The rooftop was eerily quiet, the city skyline stretching out in the distance. The water tanks loomed ahead, rusted and imposing against the gray sky. A maintenance hatch had been left slightly ajar, revealing a darkness inside that sent a shiver down my spine. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. The stench hit me first, thick and overwhelming, forcing me to gag. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I peered inside, expecting murky water. Instead, something floated just beneath the surface, bloated and pale. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just one form, it was several. The bodies were tangled together, their limbs twisted unnaturally, their faces contorted in silent screams. Some had decomposed more than others, their flesh peeling away to reveal bone. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to process the horror before me. This wasn't just some forgotten tragedy, this was recent. A sudden noise behind me made my blood run cold. The hatch to the stairwell had slammed shut, the heavy lock clicking into place. Panic surged through me as I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Footsteps echoed from somewhere nearby, slow and deliberate. I pressed myself against the cold metal door, my breath coming in short gasps. The scent of decay clung to my clothes, my stomach lurching as I fought the urge to be sick. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just out of sight. A voice, low and hoarse, whispered my name. My body went rigid, every hair on my neck standing on end. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here, hadn't spoken my name aloud since checking in. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned, but the rooftop was empty. The water in the tank sloshed, as if something inside had moved. My eyes darted back, and I saw one of the bodies shifting, an arm rising slowly from the water. My scream caught in my throat as I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the locked door. The arm stretched further, fingers curling, reaching for the edge. The rooftop lights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the rusted tanks. My chest heaved as I fought to control my breathing, every muscle in my body screaming to run. The hand gripped the rim of the tank, pulling a body upward, its drenched hair clinging to a skeletal face. Its eyes were wide, lifeless, but locked onto me. The door behind me suddenly gave way, and I tumbled into the stairwell, landing hard on my side. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. The sound of wet footsteps followed, echoing down the narrow walls. My vision blurred as I reached my floor, fumbling with my key. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it as my chest heaved with ragged breaths. The room was silent, except for my pounding heart, but I didn't feel alone. The air had grown thick, suffocating, as if something unseen lingered just beyond the dim light. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, my body frozen in fear. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my bag and rushed out, barely sparing a glance at the front desk. The clerk looked up, their eyes heavy with something unreadable, but they said nothing. I stepped onto the street, gulping in the fresh air, but the feeling of being watched never left. I never reported what I saw. I told myself it was fear, exhaustion, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Cecil Hotel held secrets that were never meant to be uncovered, and I had come too close to something that should have remained buried. Story 2. I checked into Unit 301 of the Ambassador Hotel late in the evening, the room carrying a heavy silence that felt almost unnatural. The air was thick with a musty scent, and despite the dim lighting, I could see faint, rust-colored stains on the worn carpet. I knew the stories everyone did. A murder had happened in this very room years ago, and some claimed the stains had never truly faded. As I set my bag down, a chill ran through me, though the air conditioner wasn't even on. I walked toward the bathroom, hesitating before flicking on the light. The mirror was fogged as if someone had just taken a shower, though I was alone and the room had been vacant. My gut twisted, but I forced myself to shake off the unease. The bed creaked under my weight as I sat down, flipping through my phone to distract myself. The Wisconsin Fi signal was weak, pages taking longer than they should to load. Outside, the hallway was eerily quiet, with none of the usual sounds of guests passing by or doors opening and closing. It was as if the entire floor had been abandoned. Lying back, I tried to relax, but something about the room made it impossible. The ceiling fan hummed softly, its blades casting slow-moving shadows on the walls. Just as I began to doze off, a sharp knock echoed from the door, sending my heart into my throat. When I peered through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I double-checked the lock, reassuring myself that it was secure before retreating back to the bed. The eerie stillness of the room pressed down on me, making every sound feel amplified. The old radiator groaned, the pipes clicking in a way that almost resembled whispering. I told myself it was just the building settling. A sudden creak from the closet made my breath hitch. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned my gaze toward it, the door slightly ajar when I was certain it had been closed. For a long moment I simply stared, waiting for movement, for a sign that I wasn't alone. The air grew thick with an unshakable sense of being watched. Slowly, I slid off the bed, forcing my legs to carry me closer to the closet. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, my breath shallow and unsteady. With one swift motion, I yanked the door open, revealing nothing but an empty space. Still, the feeling of unease lingered, stronger than before. I left the closet door open, unwilling to let it close again. Returning to the bed, I wrapped myself in the blanket, hoping the weight would provide some comfort. The silence stretched on, but just as I began to feel sleep creeping in, the bed shifted beneath me. It felt like someone had sat down at the edge. Every nerve in my body screamed at me not to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes darted to the foot of the bed where the blanket was pressed down as if an unseen weight rested there. My breathing turned ragged, my chest tightening with fear. The indentation lingered for several seconds before slowly rising back to normal. I shot up from the bed, flipping on every light in the room. The harsh glow did little to banish the dread twisting in my stomach. My hands were clammy as I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling over the screen. There was no way I was staying in this room another second. As I reached for my suitcase, a faint whisper brushed against my ear, too low to make out the words. My body went rigid, the sensation of breath against my skin unmistakable. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty space around me. The air felt charged, thick with an unseen presence. My pulse pounded as I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, yanking it open with more force than necessary. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering light overhead casting eerie shadows against the walls. My feet moved quickly, each step echoing unnaturally down the corridor. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby. The night clerk looked up from his desk, his brows raising slightly at my disheveled state. I told him I wanted another room, one as far from 301 as possible. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a new key with an understanding nod. As I turned to leave, he murmured something under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. "Most don't last as long as you did." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that cursed room as possible. As I stepped into my new room, the relief was instant, but the weight of what I had experienced stayed with me. Sleep was a long time coming. The next morning, as I checked out, curiosity got the better of me. I asked the clerk about Unit 301, about the stories that had circulated for years. His expression darkened, his fingers drumming against the counter. "Some say the man who died there never left," he finally said. "They clean the room, repaint the walls, but the stains always return." A chill ran through me as I recalled the faint, rust-colored marks on the carpet. I wanted to believe they were just remnants of an old stain, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some things refused to be forgotten. As I walked out of the hotel, the morning sun did little to chase away the lingering unease. I told myself I would never return, but a part of me knew the memory of that night would follow me. And no matter how far I went, I would never truly leave Unit 301 behind. Story 3. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its halls thick with dust and the scent of mildew. My job was simple: patrol the perimeter, check the interior for trespassers, and report anything unusual. But the longer I worked there, the more I noticed strange things, like doors closing on their own and whispers slipping through the empty corridors. One night, while making my rounds, I found a pile of patient files scattered across the floor of the main hall. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but as I flipped through them, my stomach clenched. Each file detailed the death of a patient, violent, unsettling ends that made my skin crawl. I almost dismissed it as a disturbing relic of the past until I recognized a name. It was a former security guard, one who had worked before me, Someone I knew had died in a freak accident just a year ago. I rifled through the pages, my hands trembling as I saw more names, each belonging to someone who had once worked here. The ways they died matched the reports I had read, down to the most chilling detail. My breath hitched as I saw the name of one of my current coworkers. I told myself it was a coincidence, that it had to be some elaborate prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I confronted my coworker, Jason, and told him about the files. He laughed it off, saying this place messed with people's heads, but I could see unease in his eyes. The next night, Jason didn't show up for work. The supervisor said Jason had called in sick, but something didn't feel right. I tried calling him, but there was no answer. The next morning, I checked the news and felt my blood run cold. Jason had been found dead in his apartment. His cause of death eerily similar to what was written in his file. I didn't want to believe it, but the pattern was too clear. Desperate for answers, I went back to where I found the files and searched through the pile again. At the very bottom was my own file, my name scrawled in the same faded ink. My hand shook as I read the details of my supposed death crushed under a collapsed ceiling in the East Wing. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. That part of the building was still standing. I told myself it was nonsense, but fear gnawed at me with every passing second. I decided to avoid the East Wing altogether, keeping my patrols limited to safer areas. But the asylum had other plans. That night during my rounds, I heard a loud crash from the East Wing, followed by the groaning of shifting wood. I wanted to run, but I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I made my way toward the sound, flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with broken doors and peeling wallpaper. Then, just as I stepped forward, a deafening crack split the silence. The ceiling above me caved in without warning, chunks of debris crashing down where I had been standing just seconds before. I had barely managed to jump back in time, dust choking my lungs as I stared at the wreckage. If I had been even a step further, I would have been buried alive. Terror clawed at my chest as I scrambled back down the hall, gasping for air. The asylum wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, feeding off those who worked within its walls. I knew then that staying here meant death, and if I didn't leave, I would be next. I quit the very next day, handing in my resignation without explanation. My supervisor barely reacted, as if he had seen this happen too many times before. As I walked out of the asylum for the last time, I glanced back at the crumbling structure. The doors seemed to stand open just a little wider, as if inviting me to return. But I never did. Story 4. I lived in a small apartment above a funeral home, a place most people would find unsettling, but I had grown used to it. The rent was cheap, and the owners, an older couple, were kind enough, keeping to themselves. Nights were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car or the creak of the old building settling. One night, I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had stirred me from sleep. As I lay there, blinking in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through my window, I heard it a slow, deliberate creak from downstairs. It was the unmistakable sound of a casket lid being lifted, the wood groaning as if reluctant to open. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, hoping I had imagined it, but the sound continued. A faint rustling followed, like fabric shifting against wood, and then an eerie silence settled over the building. I wanted to believe the funeral home owners were working late, but I knew they had locked up hours ago. I hesitated before getting out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor as I moved toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to ignore whatever was happening downstairs, but curiosity and fear pushed me forward. The hallway was dark, and I felt my way along the wall, my breath shallow. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated, staring down at the heavy door that led to the funeral home below. It was slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed before I went to bed. The air smelled of lilies and something else, something stale, like damp earth. I took a cautious step down, the wood creaking beneath my weight, and pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room beyond was dimly lit by the glow of the emergency exit sign, casting long shadows over the rows of caskets. Everything seemed undisturbed at first, but then my eyes landed on one near the center of the room. The lid was open, tilted at an odd angle, as if someone had forced it up from inside. My breath caught in my throat as I took another step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. The casket should have been empty. It was one of the display models, never used for an actual burial. A faint movement caught my eye, a shift in the shadows that sent a chill down my spine. I swallowed hard, inching closer, my hands trembling at my sides. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest as I stared at the open casket, waiting for something, anything to move again. Then, from within the darkness of the casket, a whisper brushed against my ears, barely more than a breath. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was enough to send me stumbling backward. My heel caught on the edge of a rug, and I nearly lost my balance, catching myself against a nearby casket. The whispering stopped, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing filling the room. I forced myself to step closer, gripping the edge of the open casket and peering inside. It was empty, just polished wood and velvet lining, but the air around it felt wrong, thick, almost alive. I straightened up, my skin prickling as I glanced around the room, half expecting something to lunge at me from the shadows. But there was nothing, only the stillness of the funeral home and the faint scent of flowers. I exhaled slowly, stepping back toward the stairs, ready to leave this place behind for the night. As I turned, a sharp creak split the silence and I froze. The lid of the casket shifted again, this time closing slightly, as if whatever had opened it was retreating. I didn't wait to see if it would move again. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time, slamming the door behind me as I reached the top. My hand shook as I locked it, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening for any further movement, but the silence had returned. It was as if nothing had happened at all, as if the night had swallowed the sound whole. Back in my apartment, I locked my own door and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm my racing mind. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe the old wood had simply shifted on its own. But no matter how I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that casket and that it had been aware of me. Sleep didn't come easily after that, and when morning finally arrived, I forced myself to go downstairs. The funeral home was empty, just as it should have been, and the casket in the center of the room was closed. The only sign that something had been disturbed was the faint imprint of a hand in the dust on the lid. I ran my fingers over the mark, my skin crawling as I traced the outline of long, slender fingers. It didn't match my own, and I knew for certain that I hadn't imagined last night. Whatever had been inside that casket had moved, and I had been there to witness it. The owners arrived shortly after, greeting me as if nothing was amiss. I debated telling them, but the words felt ridiculous even in my own head. Instead, I asked if any funerals had been held recently, but they shook their heads. No one had been brought in for days. I left it at that, but the unease stayed with me, a constant weight in the back of my mind. Every night after, I slept with my door locked, listening for the faintest creak from below. And though I never heard it again, I knew that whatever had stirred that night had only gone quiet, not gone away. Story 5. The mansion loomed before me, its once grand facade now weathered and covered in ivy. I had been hired to clear out the interior, a task that seemed simple enough despite the eerie rumors surrounding the place. As I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the halls. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly forms standing still in the dim light. I moved room by room, gathering old furniture and broken relics, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The deeper I ventured, the more unsettling the house became, as if it were watching me. In the study, I found a heavy bookshelf that appeared slightly misaligned with the wall. Something about it seemed off, and when I pressed against it, the wood groaned as it shifted. Behind it, a hidden door revealed itself, leading to a narrow set of stairs that descended into darkness. A musty, damp smell wafted up, sending a chill down my spine. I hesitated, gripping my flashlight tightly before stepping down. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the silence of the basement. At the bottom, the air was heavy with the scent of rust and something sour. My flashlight flickered over the walls, revealing rusted chains bolted into the stone. Old restraints lay scattered across the floor, some still secured to metal loops embedded in the walls. My pulse quickened as I realized this place had been used to confine someone or something. Among the dust and debris, I spotted a crude mattress pushed into the corner, covered in filthy blankets. Next to it sat a small pile of empty food cans, their labels faded but recent enough to suggest someone had been living here. The realization sent a wave of dread through me, and I turned sharply, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my ears like a living thing. A rusted door stood ajar at the far end of the room, leading into what seemed to be a smaller chamber. I hesitated before stepping inside, the floor gritty beneath my boots. The walls were lined with deep scratches, as if someone or something had desperately tried to claw their way out. The air felt colder here, thick with an unshakable presence. A sudden sound sent my heart hammering against my ribs, a faint shuffle, almost too quiet to be real. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight tighter, my eyes darting across the room. A pile of discarded clothing shifted slightly, the movement subtle but undeniable. Someone was still here. I took a cautious step back, my mind racing with options. If they had been hiding, they had likely seen me enter, and there was no telling how desperate they might be. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run back up the stairs and never look back. But something held me there, a dreadful curiosity rooting me in place. Another sound followed, this time a low, wheezing breath that echoed in the stillness. I turned, shining my light toward the source, and the beam landed on a hunched figure in the corner. Their clothes were tattered, their face obscured by matted hair and grime. Slowly, they raised their head, revealing sunken eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. A guttural sound escaped their throat, something between a growl and a gasp, and I stumbled back. My pulse roared in my ears as they pushed themselves up, their movements jerky, unnatural. The chains rattled against the wall as they took a step forward, the metal still fastened to their ankle. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I realized they had been trapped down here for years. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my breath ragged as I scrambled up the steps. Behind me, the chains rattled violently, followed by a strangled scream that sent a jolt of terror through my spine. My fingers fumbled at the door, yanking it open as my flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The moment I crossed the threshold, I slammed the hidden door shut, pressing my weight against it. For several seconds I stood there, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened, as if I had imagined it all. But the memory of those hollow eyes, the raw desperation in their movements, told me otherwise. I needed to leave, I needed to get as far from this place as possible. I staggered toward the front door, the old wood groaning as I yanked it open. The night air hit me like a shock, fresh and crisp compared to the stale decay inside. I stumbled down the steps, my legs weak beneath me, barely able to keep myself upright. The mansion loomed behind me, its dark windows like empty eyes watching me flee. As I reached my car, I fumbled for my keys, my hands still shaking. My mind screamed at me to drive, to leave this place and never speak of what I had seen. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been trapped in that basement was still down there, and something told me it wouldn't be locked away for much longer. Story 6. The long dirt road stretched ahead of me, flanked by towering trees that cast long shadows in the fading light. My GPS insisted the house was only a few minutes away, but the isolation was unnerving. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the further I drove, the less certain I was that I had made the right choice. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures, rustic, with a repaired porch and warm lights glowing inside. A man stood on the steps, waving at me as I pulled into the driveway. He was tall and lean, dressed in a faded flannel, his dark eyes unreadable even as he smiled. "You must be the guest," he said, stepping forward as I got out of the car. His voice was smooth, friendly, but something about it made my stomach tighten. "I'm Matt, the host. You made it just in time before dark." I had been expecting a woman named Denise, the name listed on the Airbnb profile. I hesitated before responding, my fingers tightening around my car keys. "I thought Denise owned this place," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Matt chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "She does. I just help manage things when she's out of town," he said. "She should have mentioned me in the listing. Sorry if that threw you off." It was a reasonable enough explanation, but something about the way he said it felt off. I glanced toward the house, its warm light suddenly seeming less inviting. My phone had no service, and I hadn't passed any other houses for miles. Still, I forced a smile and nodded. "All right, thanks for having me." I grabbed my bag from the car, keeping my keys in hand as I followed him inside. The interior smelled of cedar and something faintly metallic. It was cozy, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a large dining table in the center of the room. Matt watched me as I looked around, his expression unreadable. "You must be tired after the drive," he said, leaning against the wall. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. Let me know if you need anything." I murmured my thanks and made my way up the creaky wooden stairs. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a large window overlooking the woods. I set my bag down and pulled out my phone, hoping for even a weak signal, but there was nothing. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. Matt's voice followed immediately after. "Forgot to mention, the lock on your door sticks sometimes. Let me know if you need help with it." "Got it," I called back, waiting until his footsteps retreated before locking the door. My stomach twisted with unease. Something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Lying in bed later that night, I struggled to sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt intentional. Then, just past midnight, I heard something outside my window. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like someone rocking in a chair. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. Matt was sitting on the porch below, his face barely visible in the dim light, staring up at my window. I stayed frozen, willing myself to disappear into the darkness of the room. He didn't move for a long time, just sat there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest, my breaths coming shallow and fast. Eventually, he stood and disappeared into the shadows. I listened, straining to hear his footsteps, but the silence had returned. I didn't sleep after that, my ears alert to every creak and shift of the house. At sunrise, I made up my mind to leave. I grabbed my bag and moved as quietly as possible, slipping down the stairs. The house was eerily still, but as I reached the door, a voice stopped me. "Leaving already?" Matt stood in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I forced a laugh, gripping my keys tightly. "Yeah, early meeting. Just figured I'd head out now." I reached for the door handle, but his voice made me pause. "Denise never mentioned anything about a meeting," he said softly. My skin prickled. I turned slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral. "I forgot to mention it when I booked," I said. "Didn't think it'd be an issue." He studied me for a long moment, then shrugged. "No problem. Drive safe." His smile widened just slightly. "I'll let Denise know you left early." I nodded, my heart hammering as I stepped outside. The morning air was cold, but my palms were clammy with sweat. I got into my car, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway as fast as I could. As soon as I was far enough down the road, I pulled out my phone again. Still no signal. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, nearly an hour away. At a gas station, I finally got service. I pulled up the Airbnb listing, scrolling down to the host's contact information. My stomach dropped as I read the message at the bottom of the page. "This listing has been temporarily suspended due to reports of unauthorized access." I felt sick as I sat there, my hands trembling around my phone. I had spent the night in a stranger's house, a stranger who had no right to be there. And worse, he had been expecting me. Story 7. Spending the night in the Villisca axe murder house was supposed to be a joke. A stupid dare my friend Luke threw at me. We had been swapping ghost stories all night, and he bet I wouldn't last until morning inside that infamous house. It was a challenge I couldn't back down from, even though I felt a gnawing unease as I stood on the front porch. The house loomed in the moonlight, its old wooden frame groaning against the wind. I stepped inside, the air immediately thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. The floorboards creaked under my steps, each one echoing in the silence like a whispered warning. Dust motes floated in the dim light from my flashlight, the shadows stretching long and unnatural. I knew the gruesome history: 8 people, including children, slaughtered in their sleep. But I told myself it was just a house. Luke had laughed as he locked me inside, promising to return at sunrise to let me out. I rolled out my sleeping bag in what had once been the living room, keeping my flashlight close. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional groan of the old structure. As I lay down, I told myself that ghosts weren't real, that all the stories were just people scaring themselves. An hour passed, maybe more, and the house remained still. My eyelids grew heavy, and just as I began drifting off, a sound jerked me awake. It was a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the ceiling above me. My breath hitched as I turned my flashlight upward, illuminating the cracked plaster, but there was nothing there. I sat up, my pulse thudding in my ears as the sound came again, this time closer, just above my head. It wasn't the scuttling of a rat or the creak of an old house settling. It was deliberate, slow, and impossibly heavy. My skin crawled as I strained to listen, my fingers gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag. A sudden knock came from the hallway, sharp and deliberate, and I nearly stopped breathing. The air around me felt colder, pressing in on my chest like unseen hands. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I swore I heard breathing just inches from my ear. I scrambled upright, my heart slamming against my ribs, scanning the room wildly. The house had been empty when I entered, but now it felt occupied by something unseen, something watching. My instinct screamed at me to run, but the door was locked, and Luke wasn't coming back until morning. I forced myself to stay put, convincing myself that fear was playing tricks on me. Then I felt a light touch at the back of my neck, cold as ice. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the empty room and the whispering darkness. My skin prickled as I pressed my back against the wall, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The floorboards in the hallway creaked, one slow step at a time, moving toward me. I could see nothing beyond the doorway, only the inky blackness swallowing everything past the weak beam of light. The air turned thick with the scent of something metallic, something wrong. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I realized what it was: blood. My stomach twisted as the footsteps stopped just outside the room, and a quiet, rasping whisper drifted through the doorway. I didn't understand the words, but they crawled under my skin like insects burrowing deep. Then the scratching returned, this time against my back. It felt like nails dragging across my skin, slow and deliberate, sending a jolt of icy terror through me. I yelped and stumbled forward, nearly tripping over my sleeping bag. My flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When the light came back, the doorway was empty. The house remained silent, but I could still feel it, that presence, that unseen thing lurking just beyond my reach. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let my fear control me, and forced myself to stay still. Whatever was in here wanted me to panic, to run. I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my back pressed against the cold wall, flinching at every small sound. The air never lost that thick, suffocating weight, and I could still feel the phantom touch on my skin. Hours passed like an eternity, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the first light of dawn crept through the dusty windows. The moment I heard Luke's voice outside, I sprang up and rushed to the door. He laughed as he unlocked it, clearly expecting me to have chickened out hours ago. I stepped into the morning sun, my entire body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Luke's grin faded when he saw my face, and then his eyes dropped to my back. "Dude," he said, his voice losing its playful edge, "what happened to you?" Confused, I turned my head, feeling the sting for the first time. I lifted the back of my shirt, and Luke's face paled. I hurriedly pulled out my phone and flipped the camera to selfie mode, angling it to see my back. Deep, raw scratches ran across my skin, jagged and uneven, as if made by desperate, clawing fingers. My breath hitched as I traced them with my fingertips, feeling the raised welts. I hadn't rolled over onto anything sharp, hadn't scratched myself in my sleep. Luke shook his head, muttering a curse under his breath as he stepped away. Neither of us knew what to say, but we both understood what it meant. The house hadn't been empty. Something had been in there with me, something unseen but very real. The thought sent another shiver through me as I turned back to stare at the house. The morning light made it look almost normal, almost harmless, but I knew better now. I had felt its presence, carried its mark. As we walked back to the car, I made a silent vow never to return. Whatever haunted that house had touched me, and I wasn't going to tempt fate a second time. Luke drove in silence, his usual jokes absent, and I didn't blame him. Some things weren't meant to be laughed at. Some dares weren't meant to be taken. Story 8. I took a summer job restoring a historic hotel, drawn in by its rich history and the promise of decent pay. The building had stood for over a century, its once grand halls now faded with time and neglect. My job was to help refurbish the rooms, replacing old fixtures and repairing what could be salvaged. Everything was straightforward until I started working in room 217. The first time it happened, I had set my toolbox on the floor near the doorway while inspecting the warped floorboards. When I turned back, the entire box was gone, even though no one else was in the room. Confused, I searched under the furniture and checked the hallway, but it was nowhere to be found. I eventually gave up and went downstairs, only to find the toolbox sitting on the front desk. I asked the manager if he had moved it, but he only raised an eyebrow and shook his head. The front desk had been empty the entire morning, and no one had reason to move my tools. I carried the box back upstairs, unnerved but determined to finish my work. As I re-entered room 217, a chill passed over me, despite the summer heat outside. I knelt to resume fixing the floor, keeping an eye on my tools this time. The screwdriver I had just been holding slipped from my grip and landed beside me. When I reached for it, it was gone, as if the floor had swallowed it whole. Frustrated, I stood up, only to find the screwdriver sitting perfectly balanced on the windowsill. I told myself I was just exhausted, that maybe I had set it down without thinking, but the pattern continued. Wrenches vanished from my hand, only to be found balanced on a high shelf. My measuring tape disappeared mid-use, later found inside a locked supply closet. Each time the objects reappeared in places I knew they couldn't have ended up naturally. No other room gave me trouble, only room 217. When I mentioned it to the other workers, they either laughed it off or avoided the subject altogether. One of the older painters finally gave me a knowing look and said, "Some rooms don't like being disturbed." He wouldn't elaborate, and I stopped asking. Determined to finish the job, I started bringing only the tools I needed, keeping them close at all times. One afternoon, while replacing the light fixture, my hammer vanished from my belt. Before I could react, something heavy struck the floor behind me with a loud thud. I turned to see the hammer sitting in the middle of the room, as if someone had just dropped it there. I backed away, suddenly aware of how quiet the hotel had become. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing against my chest like unseen hands. The doorway seemed impossibly far, the light flickering overhead as if the wiring itself was resisting my work. I forced myself to grab my tools and leave, my hands shaking as I shut the door behind me. The next morning, I debated telling the manager that I wouldn't work in that room anymore. But something about it drew me back, a mix of fear and curiosity pulling me toward room 217. When I stepped inside, the room was just as I had left it, except for my measuring tape, which now hung neatly over the doorknob. It was as if whatever was in the room was playing a game with me. I forced myself to finish the repairs, ignoring the occasional flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. The room never felt empty, though I never saw anyone there. The strange occurrences never turned violent, but I always had the sense that I was being watched. Every misplaced tool felt intentional, as if something unseen was making a point. On my last day, I made sure all my tools were accounted for before leaving the room. As I stepped out, a gust of cold air rushed past me, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned back, expecting to see anything, but the room was still. The only thing out of place was a single nail, lying in the center of the floor, as if left there on purpose. I took the nail and slipped it into my pocket, not knowing why but feeling like I should. When I returned my key at the front desk, the manager gave me a knowing look. "Room 217 treat you well?" he asked casually. I hesitated before nodding, realizing that whatever had been in that room had let me go. Story 9. Checking into the remote motel felt like stepping into a forgotten place. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull glow over the cracked pavement. Inside the front office, the air smelled faintly of dust and something stale. The manager, an older man with tired eyes, handed me the key and paused before speaking again. "One rule," he said, his voice low. "Don't answer the door after midnight." His gaze lingered on me as if to make sure I understood. I nodded, half dismissing it as a weird local superstition, and took the key to my room. The room was small and plain, the walls yellowed from age. A single lamp cast dim light over the worn-out furniture. I tossed my bag onto the bed and checked my phone. No signal, as expected in a place like this. The silence outside pressed against the thin walls, heavy and unmoving. I tried to shake off the unease that settled in my stomach. Maybe the manager was just trying to scare me or had a problem with trespassers. Locking the door, I double-checked the window, which had only a flimsy curtain for cover. The wind outside howled softly, rattling the branches of the nearby trees. Hours passed, and exhaustion weighed on me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock on the nightstand tick forward. The air in the room felt heavier as midnight approached, thick with something unspoken. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my pulse was unsteady. At exactly 12:01, there was a knock at the door. It was light but deliberate, not the wind or a random noise. My body tensed, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, straining to listen for anything else. The knock came again, this time firmer. My mind raced, considering possibilities. It could be a lost traveler or someone needing help, but the manager's warning echoed in my head. I stayed still, not even daring to shift under the blankets. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. The knocking continued in steady, rhythmic taps. My phone still had no signal, and I regretted not checking for a motel phone. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the sound to stop. Minutes stretched painfully, each knock grating against my nerves. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, thick and suffocating. I let out a shaky breath, my hands clenched into fists under the covers. I counted the seconds, hoping whoever it was had given up. A faint shuffle outside made my skin crawl. It wasn't footsteps, but something dragging, a soft scrape against the wooden porch. I swallowed hard, every instinct telling me not to look. But curiosity gnawed at me, urging me forward. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. The bottom edge of the curtain shifted slightly, as if disturbed by movement outside. My stomach twisted as I realized there was no wind. Someone or something was still there. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding against my ribs. A shadow passed over the thin fabric, its shape indistinct but clearly human. The figure stood just beyond the door, unmoving now, as if listening. The doorknob rattled softly, sending a jolt of fear through me. My pulse roared in my ears as I pressed myself against the mattress. I willed the lock to hold, to keep whatever was outside from getting in. The rattling stopped, but the presence remained. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, slipped through the crack beneath the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound. I didn't want it to know I was awake. Minutes passed, dragging on like hours. My muscles ached from the tension, but I stayed still. Finally, the presence outside shifted, its shadow pulling away from the curtain. The sound of slow footsteps retreated into the night. I didn't move for a long time, my body locked in fear. The motel room felt colder, the air thicker, as if something had seeped in. I wanted to believe it was over, but the lingering unease told me otherwise. Dawn came agonizingly slow, the first hints of sunlight creeping through the window. Only then did I dare move, my limbs stiff and sore. I hesitated before getting up, unsure if I even wanted to look outside. Gathering my courage, I pulled the curtain back just enough to see. The porch was empty, the ground undisturbed except for a single dark mark near the door. It wasn't a footprint, but a smudge, like something had been dragged away. A chill ran down my spine as I grabbed my things. I didn't care about breakfast or checking out properly, I just needed to leave. I stepped outside, half expecting to see someone watching, but the lot was empty. The manager stood near the office, watching me with knowing eyes. "You didn't answer, did you?" he asked, his voice even but firm. I shook my head, gripping my bag tighter. He nodded, looking satisfied but weary. "Good. Some folks aren't so lucky." I wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The weight of last night clung to me, a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Without another word, I got into my car and drove away, leaving the motel behind. The further I got, the lighter the air felt, as if whatever had been there couldn't follow. But even now, the memory lingers. The sound of that knocking forever burned into my mind. Some doors are never meant to be opened. Story 10. The abandoned mining town sat in the valley, its buildings weathered and leaning under the weight of time. I had driven hours to reach it, following a winding dirt road that ended in front of a crumbling saloon. The wooden sign above the entrance had long since faded, but remnants of painted letters hinted at its former name. Pushing open the door, I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my boots. Dust coated every surface, and broken chairs lay scattered across the warped wooden planks. The long bar at the back was cracked, its mirror shattered, reflecting only jagged fragments of the room. My fingers traced the edge of the counter as I imagined the place in its prime, lamplight flickering, laughter filling the air, and the scent of whiskey lingering. The silence now felt thick, as if the walls held whispers of the past. I wandered to the far end of the saloon where a section of the wall looked different from the rest. The boards had been pried loose at some point and hastily nailed back. Curiosity pushed me forward, and I wedged my fingers into the gap, pulling until the wood groaned and gave way. Inside the hollow space, wrapped in brittle cloth, was a small leather-bound book. The diary's cover was cracked, the leather stiff with age, but the pages inside remained intact. I flipped through them carefully, scanning the faded ink. The first entry was dated March 5th, 1903, and belonged to someone named Thomas Reed. His handwriting was precise, each word penned with deliberate strokes. As I read, I felt an eerie sense of connection, as if his words had waited over a century to be found. March 5th, 1903 arrived in Silver Hollow today, looking for work. The mines are said to be rich, but the town is uneasy. The men whisper about the ones who go missing, though no one speaks of it openly. I will be careful. I turned the page, my pulse quickening. The idea of people vanishing in this long-abandoned town sent a shiver down my spine. The next entry was dated a week later, and Thomas wrote about the mine's dangers, collapsing tunnels, gas pockets, and the constant fear of accidents. But it wasn't just the mine that unsettled him. He mentioned feeling watched even in his boarding house room at night. March 12th, 1903, another man disappeared today. He went down into the mines and never returned. The foreman says it happens sometimes that the tunnels are deep and men get lost. But the others don't believe it. They say something else is down there. The further I read, the more Thomas's fear became clear. He described strange noises in the night, whispers drifting through the streets, footsteps echoing where no one walked. The town had secrets, and he had unknowingly stepped into something much older than the mine itself. Each entry grew more frantic, his words slanting across the page as if he had written in haste. March 20th, 1903, someone was outside my window last night. I saw a shadow move when I lit my lamp, but when I looked, no one was there. This place is wrong. I need to leave, but I don't know if they'll let me. I glanced around the empty saloon, my heart pounding. The idea that Thomas had felt trapped in this town, fearing for his life, made the quiet around me feel suffocating. I turned to the final entry, dated March 23rd, 1903. The ink was smudged as if his hand had trembled while writing. March 23rd, 1903. They are coming for me. I can hear them outside. It's not the miners. It's not the townsfolk. It's something else. I should not have stayed. If anyone finds this, please remember my name. The diary ended there. No explanation, no farewell, just the lingering dread of his last words. I stared at the page, my breath shallow. What had happened to Thomas Reed? Had he tried to run? Or had something found him before he could? A sudden gust of wind rattled the saloon's broken windows, making me jolt. I clutched the diary, my skin prickling as I felt the weight of the place pressing in. The air had grown heavier, as if the past itself was stirring. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but I forced myself to stand still. I looked toward the mine entrance in the distance, its dark mouth gaping at the base of the hills. The thought of going down there made my stomach turn, yet part of me needed to know. If Thomas had vanished there, maybe some trace of him remained. But the warnings in his diary echoed in my mind. A sound broke the silence, soft, deliberate footsteps outside the saloon. My breath caught, and I turned slowly, peering through the doorway. The street was empty, the town as still as it had been when I arrived. But I knew I had heard something. I gripped the diary tighter, every instinct screaming that I was not alone. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the broken buildings. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move. As much as I wanted answers, staying any longer felt like a mistake. I stepped onto the warped saloon porch, scanning the street one last time. Then I saw it. In the dirt, just beyond the saloon steps, was a single boot print. Fresh. I didn't wait. Clutching the diary to my chest, I rushed to my car, throwing open the door and sliding inside. The engine roared to life, and I backed away from the town, my hands gripping the wheel. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my mind raced with unanswered questions. As I reached the main road, I dared one last glance in the rearview mirror. The town remained lifeless, the old buildings bathed in the dimming light. But for the briefest moment, I swore I saw a shadow move between them. I drove without stopping, the diary resting on the seat beside me. Thomas Reed had wanted someone to remember his name. Now, over a century later, I did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been waiting too. And as the miles stretched between me and Silver Hollow, I knew I would never return. Story 11. The hospital stood at the edge of town, its windows shattered, its once white walls now streaked with grime. The air around it felt unnaturally still, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I had heard the stories how the place had been shut down decades ago, how people claimed to see lights flickering inside at night. Most dismissed it as urban legend, but I wanted to see for myself. Pushing open the rusted front doors, I stepped into the lobby, the stale air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The reception desk was covered in scattered papers, their edges curled and yellowed with age. Old chairs lined the walls, their cushions torn open, the stuffing spilling out like rotting innards. My flashlight cast long shadows, making the peeling wallpaper seem to shift. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the silence became. Hospitals were supposed to be full of life, doctors rushing, machines beeping, people whispering. But here, the only sound was my own breathing, the occasional drip of water from unseen leaks. I moved carefully, stepping over broken glass and debris, my pulse quickening with each passing second. Turning a corner, I froze as a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger the closer I got to the examination rooms. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, illuminating something that made my stomach drop. An old heart monitor sat in the corner, its screen glowing a sickly green. the jagged line of a pulse moving steadily across it. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. There was no power in the building, there hadn't been for years. Dust coated the machine's surface, undisturbed, as if it had been sitting there untouched for decades. And yet, the screen pulsed, the beeping sound slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through the empty halls. A sudden crash from down the corridor sent my nerves into overdrive. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping over the darkened hallway. The sound had come from a room farther in, one with its door slightly ajar. My body screamed at me to leave, but my legs carried me forward, my curiosity stronger than my fear. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing what looked like an old operating room. The overhead surgical light flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows over the rusted gurney in the center. Cabinets stood open, their contents spilled onto the floor, yellowed bandages, cracked vials, rusted scalpels. But the thing that sent chills down my spine was the ventilator in the corner, its screen blinking as if monitoring a patient. A cold wave of air rushed past me, and for a moment I swore I heard something a whisper, low and garbled, like words trapped underwater. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch the machine, expecting it to be ice cold. Instead, it was warm, as if it had been running for hours. I jerked my hand back, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The beeping grew louder, the heart monitor in the other room picking up speed. The sound reverberated through the halls, a frantic rhythm that sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through me. I backed away, my flashlight shaking, when suddenly the overhead light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, my breath coming in short gasps. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen, something watching. A metallic clang rang out behind me, and I spun around just in time to see a surgical tray slide off the counter, crashing onto the floor. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to move. Then, the ventilator let out a long, slow exhale, as if someone was lying there, struggling for breath. The air grew colder, my breath now visible in the dim glow of my flashlight. I turned toward the door, desperate to get out, but it had swung shut behind me. The handle rattled as I yanked at it, my palms slick with sweat. The beeping of the heart monitor was deafening now, erratic and urgent, as if the unseen patient was dying. My head spun as the whispers returned, growing louder, overlapping each other in a chaotic chorus. A shadow moved in the corner, just beyond my beam of light, too tall, too thin. I didn't wait to see more. I threw my weight against the door, my shoulders slamming into it with everything I had. It burst open, and I stumbled into the hallway, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. The lights in the hall flickered, casting quick, disjointed glimpses of the abandoned corridors. Machines in other rooms beeped in unison, a chorus of unseen life within the dead hospital. I ran, my footsteps echoing off the walls, the whispers chasing me. The moment I reached the front doors, they swung open on their own, as if the building itself was expelling me. I didn't stop until I was outside, my chest heaving, my legs shaking beneath me. The hospital stood in silence once more, its windows dark, the eerie hum of the machines gone. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I staggered back to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. The night air was thick, suffocating, my skin still tingling with the sensation of being watched. As I started the engine, my radio crackled to life, though I hadn't touched it. A single sound filtered through the static, a long, drawn-out beep, flat and final. I sped away, the hospital shrinking in my rearview mirror, but I knew it wasn't over. The machines had been running for someone, something, and I had interrupted them. As I reached the outskirts of town, my dashboard flickered, my radio hissing again. Through the interference, a single word whispered through the speakers. Stay. Story 12. The drive to the old plantation turned bed and breakfast took me through miles of sprawling oak trees draped in Spanish moss. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the grand white house. The owner, a tall, thin man named Mr. Carlyle, greeted me at the front door with a polite but distant demeanor. As he led me inside, I noticed the air held a faint scent of aged wood and something else, something damp, like earth after a storm. My room was on the second floor, a cozy space with antique furniture and a view of the overgrown garden. As I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had secrets buried within its walls. The hallway outside my room was lined with paintings of solemn-faced individuals, their eyes seemingly following me wherever I moved. At the end of the hall, I saw a staircase leading up to the third floor, but a heavy wooden door barred the way. During dinner, I casually asked Mr. Carlyle about the locked third floor. His expression darkened for a fraction of a second before he forced a smile. "That floor is off limits," he said, his tone firm and final. When I pressed for details, he simply shook his head and changed the subject, leaving me more curious than ever. Later that night, I lay in bed listening to the quiet creaks of the old house settling. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, a faint noise reached my ears, soft footsteps coming from above. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear more. The sound continued for a few moments before fading into silence, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it. Determined to find answers, I woke early the next morning and decided to explore the grounds. The plantation's garden was overgrown with wild vines and forgotten statues covered in moss. Behind the house, I found a crumbling shed with rusted tools and faded photographs scattered inside. One photo caught my eye. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house, but their faces had been scratched out. I returned to the house with the photo tucked in my pocket, intent on asking Mr. Carlyle about it. He was nowhere to be found, so I wandered through the halls, stopping once more in front of the locked third-floor door. I ran my fingers over the old wood, feeling the deep grooves and scratches near the handle. Before I could stop myself, I tried turning the knob, but it didn't budge. That night, the sounds from above returned, louder this time, almost frantic. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth just beyond the locked door. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing, debating whether to investigate. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a single, slow knock on the floor above me. Morning arrived, bringing with it a thick fog that clung to the plantation like a ghostly veil. I found Mr. Carlyle in the dining room, his face drawn and pale as if he hadn't slept. I placed the photograph on the table before him, watching as his hands trembled. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When I told him, he exhaled sharply and looked away. "There's nothing up there," he finally said, but I could hear the lie in his voice. When I refused to let it go, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "The third floor was sealed off long ago for good reason," he admitted. "Some places hold on to their past, and some things should be left alone." His words only fueled my determination. That night, when the house had settled into silence, I crept out of my room with a small flashlight. The third floor door loomed at the end of the hallway, and as I reached it, my breath caught in my throat. The lock was undone. The door, which had been so solidly shut, now hung slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I was met with a rush of stale, cold air. The third floor was nothing like the rest of the house. Dust-coated furniture sat untouched, and long curtains hung limply over tall windows. My flashlight flickered, casting shifting shadows along the peeling wallpaper. Then, I heard the soft shuffle of feet just beyond the doorway at the end of the hall. I stepped forward cautiously, heart hammering, and reached for the handle of the last door. As I touched it, a sudden heavy weight pressed against my back, pushing me forward. I stumbled into the room, the door slamming shut behind me. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers started faint. Overlapping voices murmuring words I couldn't understand. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching unnaturally as the whispers rose in urgency. I turned to flee, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at my throat as I pounded against the wood, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the room fell silent. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't hesitate. I ran down the stairs, past the empty hallways, and out into the night air, gasping for breath. Mr. Carlyle was waiting on the porch, his expression unreadable. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked softly. I couldn't speak, only nod. He sighed, glancing up at the dark windows of the third floor. "This place remembers everything," he murmured, "and some memories refuse to fade." I left the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that had been waiting. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing in the third floor window, watching me leave. Story 13. I was driving home late when I decided to take a shortcut through a part of town I had never been to before. The streets were empty, the buildings worn down and forgotten, their signs faded with age. I should have turned around when I noticed the streetlights flickering, but curiosity pushed me forward. That was when I saw a brightly lit diner standing at the corner of an otherwise lifeless block. The neon sign above the entrance read Marlowe's Diner in bold red letters, glowing steadily against the dark night. Something about it seemed off, like it had been plucked from another time and dropped right in front of me. The chrome-trimmed windows gleamed, the booths inside were pristine, and the sound of a jukebox hummed through the air. It looked too perfect, too untouched by time, and yet, there it was. I parked my car and stepped inside, immediately hit with the scent of coffee and grilled burgers. The place was packed with people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, men in pressed suits and fedoras, women in bright dresses with curled hair. A waitress in a blue uniform walked past carrying a tray of milkshakes, her name tag reading Betty in looping cursive. No one looked up at me, as if I belonged there, as if nothing about my presence was unusual. I slid into an empty booth, glancing around at the other diners. A man at the counter read a newspaper dated 1957, his fingers flipping the pages like it was just another ordinary day. A teenage couple in the corner shared a plate of fries, their laughter light and carefree. The jukebox in the corner crackled before launching into an old rock and roll tune, its sound filling the diner like a heartbeat. A waiter approached, placing a menu in front of me without a word. The paper was crisp, the font old-fashioned, listing items at prices that hadn't existed in decades. 10-cent coffee, 15-cent pie, a full meal for under $1. My mouth felt dry as I ran my fingers over the page, the reality of what I was seeing sinking in. This wasn't some themed diner or a forgotten relic. It was as if time had never touched this place at all. I hesitated before ordering a coffee, my voice sounding strange in the quiet hum of conversation. The waiter nodded and walked away, his polished shoes making no sound against the checkered floor. My hands trembled slightly as I looked around again, noticing small details I had missed before. The air smelled different, cleaner, without the pollution of modern cars or the faint scent of plastic and chemicals. I reached for my phone, wanting to take a picture, but the screen was dark. No service, no battery indicator, nothing. The moment my fingers touched the screen, the conversation in the diner faltered, just for a second. A few people turned their heads slightly, their eyes sharp and questioning before returning to their meals. A shiver ran down my spine as I quickly slipped the phone back into my pocket. The coffee arrived in a plain white mug, steaming and rich with a scent that reminded me of something I couldn't place. I took a sip, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. The warmth spread through me, grounding me in the moment, tricking me into believing I had just stumbled upon a well-preserved old diner. But the illusion shattered when the front door creaked open. A man walked in, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. The conversation in the diner hushed, the jukebox crackling before falling silent. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on me. The air grew thick, heavy with something unspoken, something unseen. My instincts screamed at me to leave. He took a seat at the counter, nodding once to the waiter who placed a black coffee in front of him. The atmosphere remained tense as the other diners subtly avoided looking at him. My hands curled into fists beneath the table as I tried to steady my breathing. Something about this man didn't belong here, and yet neither did I. I pushed the coffee away and stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Eyes flickered toward me, brief but watchful, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I forced myself to walk calmly toward the door, every step feeling heavier, the air pressing against me like a weight. The man at the counter turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his eyes dark, empty, and knowing. I shoved the door open and stepped outside, the night air cool against my skin. The moment I crossed the threshold, a strange silence followed me, as if the diner's sounds had been cut off entirely. My car was right where I left it, untouched, waiting. I got in, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled away from the curb, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. The diner's glow faded behind me, swallowed by the darkness of the abandoned street. When I finally glanced back, there was nothing there. The lot was empty, no sign of the gleaming windows or the neon sign. I drove straight home, locking my doors and sitting in silence for what felt like hours. My phone flickered back to life, the screen glowing as if nothing had happened. I checked the time exactly as it had been when I first entered the diner, as if not a second had passed. The coffee's taste still lingered on my tongue. The next day, I went back to the same street, determined to find it again. The buildings stood as they had before, crumbling, forgotten, lifeless. But where the diner had been, there was only an empty lot, cracked pavement stretching toward the horizon. A single rusted sign lay in the weeds, its lettering barely visible beneath the grime. Marlowe's Diner closed since 1957. I never took that shortcut again. Story 14. The trail had been overgrown, barely a path at all, but curiosity kept me moving forward. I had been hiking for hours, following an old map that hinted at something hidden deep in these woods. When the trees finally thinned, I found myself staring at what looked like a town frozen in time. Wooden buildings, weathered and leaning, stood in eerie silence beneath the late afternoon sky. I stepped cautiously into the empty street, my boots kicking up dust that had long settled. The buildings were intact but lifeless, their windows gaping like hollow eyes. A saloon sign hung by a single rusted chain, swaying slightly in the breeze. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, thick with the weight of something long forgotten. Moving deeper, I passed what must have been a general store, its door hanging open, revealing empty shelves. Beyond it stood a row of houses, their doors shut tight, as if the residents had simply walked away one day and never returned. The silence pressed in on me, a stillness so complete that even the birds had gone quiet. Then, the sound of a bell shattered the quiet, its deep toll echoing through the empty town. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the source, my eyes locking onto a church at the end of the street. The bell tower loomed above it, the rope swinging on its own, pulled by unseen hands. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The bell rang again, slower this time, as if calling someone or something. I scanned the buildings, expecting movement, a shadow in a window, a figure at a doorway. But I was alone, and yet the bell continued to toll. My legs felt heavy as I approached the church, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, the door creaking open at the slightest push. Inside, rows of pews stood in perfect formation, coated in dust, untouched by time. At the front, a pulpit stood beneath the towering bell tower, its presence oppressive. The air inside was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I stepped forward, my boots leaving faint prints in the dust, proof that I was the only one who had been here in years. And yet the bell still rang, the vibrations traveling through the wood beneath my feet. I tilted my head back, staring up at the darkened rafters, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The bell rope swung wildly, but no one stood beneath it, no hands gripped it. It moved with purpose, as if an unseen force commanded it to ring. A sudden gust of wind blew through the open doors, snuffing out what little light had filtered inside. The wooden walls groaned as if the entire building were exhaling, a low, unsettling sound that sent a chill down my spine. I turned, ready to leave, but something caught my eye near the pulpit. A book lay open on the altar, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled in thick ink, the words almost frantic. I leaned in, my fingers hovering over the brittle paper as I read the last entry aloud. We heard the bell, but no one rang it. We locked the doors, but it kept ringing. We left, but the sound followed us into the woods. A floorboard creaked behind me, soft but deliberate, and I froze. My skin prickled as I turned, expecting to see someone standing there. But the church was empty, only the pews and dust filled air stretching before me. The bell gave one final, deafening toll before falling silent, the stillness more unsettling than the sound itself. My breath came fast as I backed toward the door, my body urging me to run. The moment I stepped outside, the wind died, and the town returned to its eerie quiet. I hurried through the street, glancing back at the church one last time. The doors stood wide open, as if inviting me to return, but I had no intention of doing so. As I passed the abandoned buildings, I noticed something I hadn't before: footprints in the dust, leading toward the woods. They weren't mine. Panic clawed at my chest as I picked up my pace, my boots crunching against the dirt road. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the ground. The wind stirred again, carrying a whisper so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. The trees loomed ahead, their dark forms promising safety, but something inside me knew better. As I stepped past the first row of trunks, the weight of the town seemed to follow me. I glanced back once, just for a second, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood at the edge of the church steps, barely visible in the fading light. It was motionless, watching, its face hidden beneath the shadows of the bell tower. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me into the woods, away from whatever waited behind me. Branches clawed at my arms as I ran, my breath ragged, my heartbeat a frantic drum in my chest. The trail I had followed earlier seemed endless now, the trees stretching impossibly high. The farther I went, the louder my own footsteps sounded, echoing as if something ran just behind me. The whispering returned, closer now, threading through the wind like a voice just out of reach. I refused to look back, pushing forward until I could see the outline of my car through the trees. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I reached the door, my hands shaking too hard to grip the handle. A low creak echoed from the woods, like the groan of an old door swinging open. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. My breathing was uneven, my hands white-knuckled against the steering wheel as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow road ahead. In the rearview mirror, the trees swayed gently, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. But I knew better. As I drove away, the wind carried one final sound through the trees. Faint but unmistakable, the church bell rang once more. Story 15. The old prison stood on the edge of town, its stone walls weathered by time but still imposing. Once a place of punishment, it had been converted into a museum, drawing tourists fascinated by its dark history. I had always been intrigued by abandoned places, and this was no exception. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt colder, carrying the weight of years long past. The tour guide led us through narrow hallways lined with rusted bars, recounting the brutal history of the inmates who had once been confined here. Their crimes varied. Some were murderers, others petty thieves who had met cruel fates behind these walls. The cells were left as they had been, complete with old cots, rusting chains, and crude carvings scratched into the stone. Despite the warm afternoon outside, the air inside felt damp, thick with an unshakable presence. I lingered behind as the group moved forward, drawn to a particular cell near the end of the row. The small cot was covered in dust, but the impression of a body still seemed to linger on the thin mattress. Faint tally marks were carved into the wall, counting days long since forgotten. Just as I reached out to trace them with my fingers, a whisper of movement caught my ear from the next cell over. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat as I peered inside. The cell was empty, the cot undisturbed, but the air felt different, charged, as if someone had just been there. A chill crept along my spine, and I hurried to catch up with the group. The guide continued speaking about the nightly roll calls that had once governed the prison, a strict routine that had never been broken. As the tour ended, the guide mentioned an unusual phenomenon that some visitors had reported. At night, when the museum was closed and the halls were empty, echoes of the old roll calls could still be heard. Some had claimed to hear footsteps marching in unison, voices calling out names that had long since faded from history. The guide laughed, dismissing it as superstition, but I saw the unease flicker in his eyes. Determined to see for myself, I arranged to stay after closing, convincing the curator that I was writing an article about the prison's history. As the last visitors left and the staff locked up, I wandered the halls alone, the silence settling heavily around me. The cells stood empty, their doors gaping like open mouths, yet the feeling of being watched never left. Hours passed, and the night deepened, wrapping the prison in an eerie stillness. I sat in the main hall, my flashlight casting long shadows against the stone walls. Then, at exactly midnight, the air shifted. A distant sound echoed through corridors, the sharp clap of boots against stone, marching in perfect rhythm. I stood, my pulse hammering, as the footsteps grew louder, moving toward the main hall. Faint voices followed, calling out names in a monotone, each syllable precise and practiced. The roll call had begun. I gripped my flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness as I strained to see the source. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen yet undeniably present. The voices continued, listing names I had never heard before, each one followed by a muffled response. I stepped closer, peering down the hall where the sound seemed strongest. The cells remained empty, their iron bars still locked, yet the voices persisted as if the inmates were still there. A sudden, Suffocating cold wrapped around me, and I turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing behind me. The corridor remained empty, but the feeling of unseen eyes bore into me. The shadows along the walls seemed to shift, stretching unnaturally as if something moved within them. My breath fogged in the freezing air, my body paralyzed with dread. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the roll call ended. The silence that followed was even more unsettling, pressing against my ears like a thick blanket. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move, to escape the oppressive weight of the prison's past. As I hurried toward the exit, a single sound stopped me in my tracks, a faint rustling from one of the cells. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it toward the source. One of the cots, untouched for decades, bore the unmistakable indent of a body that had not been there before. The faint outline of a head, a torso, as if someone had just risen moments ago. My breath hitched as the realization set in whatever had been here. It had never truly left. I bolted for the exit, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The heavy door groaned as I shoved it open, the rush of night air a relief against my clammy skin. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands fumbling with the keys as I forced myself inside. The prison loomed behind me, dark and silent, yet I could still hear the faint echo of names being called in the distance. Sleep didn't come easily that night, my mind replaying the experience over and over. The voices, the phantom footsteps, the undeniable feeling of being watched. No logical explanation could account for what I had witnessed. But deep down, I knew the truth: the prison still held its inmates, even if their bodies had long since turned to dust. The next morning I returned to the museum, hoping to find some rational explanation. The staff greeted me with polite smiles, but when I mentioned the roll call, their expressions darkened. One older employee hesitated before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "It happens every night. Has for years. The prison doesn't forget its routine." I left without another word, the weight of his statement lingering in my mind. As I drove away, I cast one last glance at the looming stone walls in my rearview mirror. The prison stood as it always had, unyielding and cold, a monument to the past. And somewhere within its depths, the echoes of the dead continued to march, bound to a routine that would never end. Story 16. The road stretched endlessly ahead of us, cutting through miles of empty landscape with no signs of life. We had been driving for hours, the gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. When we finally saw a small, faded sign for a gas station up ahead, relief washed over us. It was the first sign of civilization we had seen in a long time. The station itself was old, the paint on the building peeling, the windows dark and coated in grime. The pumps stood motionless, their screens cracked and weathered. There were no cars, no employees, no open signs, just an eerie silence that settled over the place. The only thing that looked remotely functional was the security cameras mounted on the building, their lenses glinting in the afternoon sun. We pulled up to the pump, but as expected, it didn't turn on. Sarah tried pressing a few buttons, but nothing happened. "Maybe we should check inside," Jason suggested, glancing at the darkened windows. "There's got to be someone here if the cameras are running." The door to the convenience store was slightly ajar, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and something faintly rotten. The shelves were still stocked with old snacks and drinks, their packaging faded and brittle. The register sat covered in a thin layer of dust, untouched for what looked like years. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the emptiness. There was no response, just the soft hum of something electrical in the back. A flickering light overhead cast long, distorted shadows along the floor. I turned to Jason and Sarah, both of whom looked just as uneasy as I felt. "Someone has to be paying for the electricity," Sarah whispered, eyes darting toward the security cameras inside. They were moving, adjusting slightly as if tracking our every move. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. Someone or something was watching us. Jason walked behind the counter, peering into the open doorway that led to the back room. "There's an office back here," he said, pushing the door open wider. The room was cramped, filled with old paperwork and a single chair in front of a desk. A dozen monitors lined the wall, all displaying live security footage of the gas station. The screens showed different angles: the pumps outside, the aisles inside. The entrance but one in particular made my breath catch. It showed us standing in the office watching the monitors. But there was something else. A figure in the background, standing just outside the store's entrance. Sarah gasped, spinning around to look back through the door. There was nothing there. Jason ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." His voice was sharp, urgent, and I didn't argue. We rushed out of the office, back through the aisles toward the front door. The security cameras followed our movements. The soft mechanical were the only sound in the dead silence. As we stepped outside, the air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing against us. The figure we had seen on the screen was nowhere in sight. The gas pumps were still dark, lifeless, and our car sat waiting just as we had left it. I fumbled with my keys, unlocking the doors with shaky hands. "Get in," I urged, glancing around, my pulse pounding. Jason and Sarah climbed in, slamming their doors shut. I started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The moment I put the car in reverse, something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow darted between the pumps, too fast for me to get a clear look. The cameras continued to follow us as we backed away. The unease in my stomach twisted into something worse, something close to fear. "Don't stop," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Just drive." I didn't need to be told twice. I pressed the gas, pulling out onto the road, the station shrinking behind us in the rearview mirror. Jason kept looking back, his face tense. I swear I saw someone standing by the store again, right before we left. I didn't want to turn around to check. My hands felt cold against the wheel, my knuckles white as I focused on the road ahead. Who the hell runs a gas station with no people but working cameras? Sarah muttered, hugging her arms around herself. Jason exhaled sharply. "Someone who doesn't want to be seen," he said. "Or maybe someone who's already dead." The words sent a fresh wave of chills through me, and I tightened my grip on the wheel. We drove for miles without speaking, the road stretching endlessly ahead. My heart only started to slow when we finally saw another gas station, this one bright and modern, with actual cars parked outside. I pulled in, relieved beyond words. We got out, and Sarah immediately went to the pump, testing it. It worked. Jason went inside to pay while I leaned against the car, exhaling slowly. My eyes flicked to the security cameras on the roof of the station, their red lights blinking. I shuddered, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When Jason returned, he was pale. I asked the clerk about the old gas station back there, he said, his voice tight. He looked at me like I was crazy. I frowned, feeling a prick of unease. "What do you mean?" "He said that station shut down 10 years ago," Jason muttered. "Said it burned down in a fire. No one's been there since." My stomach dropped, the memory of the working security cameras flashing in my mind. Sarah let out a nervous laugh, but it lacked any real humor. That doesn't make sense. We were just there. She glanced back toward the road, as if expecting to see it appear again. We saw the cameras moving. We saw she stopped herself, swallowing hard. None of us knew what to say after that. We filled the tank in silence, the weight of what we had seen pressing down on us. As we pulled back onto the road, I made a silent promise to myself I would never stop at an abandoned gas station again, no matter how empty the tank. Story 17. The cabin was exactly what I wanted: secluded, quiet, and surrounded by endless stretches of forest. I had planned a week away from everything, a break from the city noise and stress. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and for the first few hours I felt completely at peace. That peace lasted until my neighbors showed up. They were an older couple, their faces lined with years of hard living, their eyes shadowed with something unreadable. I had barely finished unpacking when they knocked on my door, their expressions tense. The woman clutched her husband's arm as he cleared his throat, glancing nervously at the sky. "You should leave before sunset," he said. I frowned, taken aback by the urgency in his voice. "Why?" I asked, glancing at the dense trees that surrounded the cabin. The woman inhaled sharply and shook her head, gripping her husband's sleeve. "You'll see," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I let out a short laugh, thinking it had to be some local superstition or an attempt to scare outsiders. "I'll be fine," I assured them, but they didn't look convinced. The man stared at me for a long moment before muttering something under his breath and turning away. His wife hesitated before following, but not before giving me one last uneasy glance. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I tried to brush off their warning. I told myself people in small towns had strange beliefs, and this was probably just one of them. I settled on the porch with a beer, watching the sky shift from blue to deep orange. The woods beyond the cabin seemed to darken too quickly, shadows stretching unnaturally long. A heavy silence settled over the mountains, different from the peaceful quiet of earlier. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, nothing but an eerie stillness. A creeping unease crawled up my spine as I stood, suddenly feeling exposed in the open air. The last of the sunlight faded behind the trees, and that's when I heard it. It started as a low, distant hum, almost like the wind moving through the trees. But there was no wind, and the sound wasn't natural, it was layered, as if multiple voices were murmuring at once. My breath caught as the humming grew louder, swelling into a rhythmic chant. The sound seemed to circle the cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I backed toward the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. Just as I reached for the handle, something moved in the tree line. At first I thought it was an animal, but the shape was wrong: too tall, too thin. The figure stood unnaturally still, its head tilted slightly as if watching me. A shiver ran through me as I realized there was more than one. Dozens of figures emerged from the trees, their bodies blending with the darkness. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light from the cabin. The humming continued, growing in intensity, vibrating through my chest. My fingers fumbled with the doorknob as I yanked it open, stumbling inside. I locked the door and backed away, my mind racing to make sense of what I had seen. The humming didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, pressing against the walls of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the window, hesitating before peering outside. The figures were closer now, standing in a perfect circle around the cabin. Their heads moved in unison, tilting to the side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. My breathing was shallow, my hands slick with sweat as I backed away from the window. The cabin felt smaller, the air inside suffocating as the chanting turned into something worse: whispers. Dozens of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, filling every corner of the room. A sharp knock on the door made me jump, my heart slamming against my ribs. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, it was slow, methodical, deliberate. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still, to breathe. The knocking stopped, but the whispers didn't. They were inside now. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the room. The light flickered, struggling against the overwhelming darkness that had seeped into the cabin. The shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching toward me, reaching. My head throbbed as a pressure built behind my eyes, a crushing force pressing down on me. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The air lightened, the pressure lifting from my chest. I stood frozen, my ears straining in the silence. Slowly, I stepped toward the window again, dreading what I might see. The figures were gone. The forest looked normal, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. My hands still shook, my body still hummed with the echoes of the whispers. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid that if I did, I wouldn't wake up. At the first light of dawn, I grabbed my things and threw them into my car. My neighbors were already outside, watching as I slammed my trunk shut. The older man nodded, as if he had expected this, while his wife simply looked relieved. "You saw," she said softly. I didn't respond, didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. I climbed into my car and drove away, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. But even as I left the mountains behind, the whispers stayed with me, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for nightfall. Story 18. The old school had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. I had heard stories about it, whispers of strange occurrences and unsettling sounds that kept people away. That only fueled my curiosity, so I decided to explore it one evening before the sun had completely set. The front doors were locked, but a broken window near the gym made for an easy entrance. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of mold lingered in the stale air. My flashlight cut through the dimness, illuminating rows of rusted lockers and peeling posters from another era. Desks were overturned in classrooms, their contents scattered as if the students had left in a hurry. A faint breeze moved through the hallways, carrying the distant sound of something scuttling in the walls. I made my way to the main hallway, stepping carefully over broken glass and debris. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made every small noise seem amplified. As I passed what used to be the principal's office, a faint sound caught my attention. It was soft at first, but as I focused, I realized it was laughter, high-pitched, like children playing in the distance. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The school had been empty for years, with no signs of squatters or recent activity. The laughter echoed down the hall, distant yet unmistakable. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I forced myself to follow the sound, my footsteps unnervingly loud against the cracked tiles. The laughter grew clearer as I reached the old gymnasium. The double doors were slightly ajar, swaying gently as if someone had just passed through. I pushed them open, revealing a vast, empty space filled with broken bleachers and a warped wooden floor. The basketball hoops still hung from the ceiling, their nets long gone. I stepped inside cautiously, sweeping my flashlight across the room. There was no one there, just dust and decay, untouched for years. But the laughter still echoed, bouncing off the walls as if an unseen group of children were running and playing. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it wasn't coming from a single spot but from all around me. I turned sharply, half expecting to see shadows darting across the gym floor. The sound faded for a brief moment, replaced by a sudden hush, as if whatever was there had just noticed me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took a slow step backward, suddenly feeling like I had intruded on something I wasn't meant to witness. A faint creak sounded from the bleachers, and my flashlight flickered as if reacting to something unseen. I aimed it toward the rows of old seating, but there was nothing there, just dust motes floating in the stale air. Another laugh, closer this time, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. It wasn't friendly or innocent, it was knowing. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. They were light, like small feet running across the floor. But when I whipped around, the gym was still empty. My heartbeat thundered as the laughter started again, this time right next to my ear. I bolted, pushing through the doors and sprinting down the hall without looking back. My breath came in ragged gasps as I passed dark classrooms, the broken windows allowing the last bit of daylight to cast eerie shadows. The laughter followed me, growing distorted, as if whoever was making the sound was chasing me. Reaching the broken window where I had entered, I scrambled out, nearly tripping on the loose bricks outside. As soon as I hit the pavement, the laughter stopped abruptly, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I turned back, my chest heaving, and for a moment, I swore I saw movement in one of the windows. It was too fast to be sure, but it was there watching. I didn't stick around to find out more. I hurried away, my mind racing with what I had just experienced. The school had been abandoned for decades, but something still remained within its walls. I had gone there looking for an adventure, but I left with the overwhelming feeling that I had disturbed something that never truly left. Story 19. The apartment was nothing special, but for the price, I couldn't complain. The walls were thin, the carpet was old, and the kitchen smelled faintly of something stale. Still, it was mine, and that was all that mattered. I unpacked slowly, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into my stomach. Something about the place felt off, but I convinced myself it was just the newness of it. I had never lived alone before, and the silence was unsettling. The pipes groaned when I turned on the sink, and the light in the bathroom flickered when I flipped the switch. I made a mental note to call the landlord about it, though I doubted he'd care. As I set up my toiletries in the bathroom, I noticed the mirror was loose. It wobbled slightly when I adjusted it, and curiosity got the best of me. I slipped my fingers into the small gap at the edge and pulled gently. The mirror popped free with a soft creak, revealing a dark, empty space behind it. At first, I thought it was just a gap in the wall, a hollow space left unfinished. But then I saw something crammed inside, folded and shoved deep into the cavity. My stomach tightened as I reached in and pulled out a stack of paper. The edges were worn, yellowed with age, and the weight of them made my hands shake. I unfolded one and felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a missing person poster, the kind you see taped to telephone poles and store windows. The woman's face stared back at me, her eyes wide and hopeful. I shuffled through the stack, my pulse hammering as I saw more and more faces, each one paired with desperate pleas for information. There were dozens of them, maybe more. Some were faded, their ink smudged and blurred, while others looked newer, crisp and clean. My fingers trembled as I counted them, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. Someone had hidden these here, tucked them away where no one was meant to find them. A cold dread settled deep in my stomach as I stared at the papers. What were they doing here? Why hide them behind the mirror? My hands felt clammy as I flipped through them again, scanning the dates. Some were years old, but a few were recent, too recent. I dropped the papers onto the sink and backed away, suddenly aware of how small the bathroom felt. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. I needed to get out of there, to breathe, to think. My apartment no longer felt like mine. It felt like something else, something wrong. I grabbed my phone and searched the names on the posters. The results made my skin crawl. These weren't just random disappearances, each case was linked to this area. Some were last seen just blocks away, others had vanished from this very building. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through article after article. The more I read, the worse it got. Tenants had gone missing over the years, always without a trace. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. They had simply vanished, their apartments left untouched. The landlord had changed multiple times, always dodging questions, always moving on before anyone could dig too deep. I turned toward the mirror, my reflection pale and wide-eyed. How many people had lived here before me? How many had left behind traces of themselves, only to be erased? The walls felt thinner now, the air heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. A noise outside made me jump. It was soft, barely audible, like footsteps in the hall. I held my breath, straining to listen. The floorboards creaked just beyond my door, slow and deliberate. Someone was there. I crept to the peephole, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway was dimly lit, the old bulbs casting long, flickering shadows. At first I saw nothing, just the empty corridor stretching into darkness. Then, movement. A shape just beyond the edge of the light, standing perfectly still. My breath hitched as I stepped back. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking, weren't moving closer. They were just standing there, waiting. The air in my apartment felt colder, my skin prickling with unease. I glanced at the missing posters, their silent faces watching me. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing my bag, I stuffed my essentials inside, my movements rushed and clumsy. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run, to leave this place behind. But as I reached for the door, the handle rattled. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The knob twisted slowly, testing, pushing. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stepped away, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The lock held, but for how long? The rattling stopped, replaced by silence. I waited, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. Then, finally, footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps moving away from my door. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I threw my bag over my shoulder and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air still felt wrong, thick with something unseen. I didn't look back as I rushed down the stairs, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Outside, the night was cool, the streetlights buzzing faintly. I kept walking, putting as much distance between me and that building as I could. My mind raced with questions, but one thought overpowered them all. I had to warn someone. I found the nearest police station, my hands still shaking as I stepped inside. The officer at the desk listened as I explained, his expression shifting from skepticism to something darker. He took the stack of posters from me, his eyes scanning the names. "This isn't the first time we've heard about that place," he said, his voice grim. "But no one's ever found proof like this." His gaze met mine, serious and unreadable. "You were lucky to get out." "Aunt." A shiver ran down my spine. I thought about the footsteps, the way the knob had turned so slowly. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I didn't know what would have happened if I had stayed. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind, unwilling to step foot inside again. Some things aren't worth the risk. aren't worth the questions. Whatever had happened in that place, I wasn't going to be the next name on a poster. Story 20. The lighthouse stood alone on the rocky cliffside, its white stone walls weathered by the salty air. The locals had long abandoned it, leaving it to the mercy of the wind and waves. I had always been fascinated by places like this, remnants of the past that refused to be forgotten. When I had the chance to stay overnight, I didn't hesitate, eager to experience the solitude and history firsthand. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and rusted metal, the scent of time settling into the walls. The stairs spiraled upward, leading to the lantern room where the massive signal light had once guided ships through treacherous waters. Dust coated the glass panes, and the machinery was long out of commission. Yet, standing there, I could almost hear the echo waves crashing against unseen hulls. The room where I would sleep was small, with a narrow bed and a wooden desk pushed against the wall. A single oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows that danced with every movement. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks, making the old building groan as if protesting my presence. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and settled in, listening to the restless sea below. Sometime after midnight, a sharp creaking sound pulled me from sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against the old frame, but then I saw the faint glow. It was coming from the lantern room above, an eerie light pulsing against the darkness. My stomach tightened as I sat up, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a trick of the moon. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the spiral staircase, each step groaning beneath my weight. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and the light intensified, casting shifting patterns across the walls. When I reached the top, I hesitated before pushing open the heavy door. The moment I did, my breath caught in my throat. The massive signal light, which had been out of order for decades, was glowing with an unnatural brightness. It turned slowly, its beam sweeping across the ocean before stopping at a fixed point in the distance. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering as I followed its path. Far below, through the haze of mist and moonlight, lay the skeletal remains of a shipwreck. I had read about it before, a passenger vessel lost in a storm back in 1896. The wreck had never been recovered, its remains scattered along the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff. No survivors had ever been found, and the cause of the disaster remained unknown. Yet here I was, standing in an abandoned lighthouse, watching as its dead beacon pointed directly at the wreckage. A gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine, but the air inside was still. I reached for the controls, but they were rusted, unmoving, the machinery lifeless. There was no explanation for how the light had turned on. My reflection in the glass looked pale, my eyes wide with unease. I backed away, half expecting something to move within the beam. Then I saw it. A shape, barely visible through the mist, standing at the edge of the wreckage. My breath hitched as I strained to see more clearly, but the figure remained distant, unmoving. It was impossible for anyone to be down there. The cliffs were too steep, the waves too treacherous. Yet, as I watched, the figure slowly lifted an arm, as if signaling toward the lighthouse. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, my legs weak with uncertainty. I turned away from the window, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. But as I did, a sound filled the room, a low, mournful wail, carried by the wind but distinct from it. My fingers gripped the edge of the lantern housing, my pulse hammering. The sound was coming from below. I hesitated before making my way down the stairs, each step slower than the last. The wailing grew clearer, less like the wind and more like voices, layered over each other in a chorus of sorrow. When I reached the main floor, the temperature had dropped, my breath visible in the dim light. The door to the outside creaked as if someone had just pushed it open. Steeling myself, I stepped out onto the rocky ground, the cold biting through my clothes. The beam from the lighthouse still pointed at the wreck, illuminating the dark waters swirling around it. I scanned the cliffs below, half expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I heard something much closer, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The path was empty, the door to the lighthouse swaying slightly in the wind. My skin prickled, the feeling of being watched stronger than before. I took a step back toward the entrance, my mind racing for an explanation. The night pressed in, the sound of the waves growing louder. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the light from the lantern room flickered and died. Darkness swallowed the landscape, leaving only the dim glow of my flashlight. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding in my ears. I turned and rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me. The walls felt closer now, the silence deeper, as if something had been disturbed. I forced myself to sit on the edge of the bed, gripping the blanket to steady my shaking hands. The wailing had stopped, the night eerily still. I told myself I would leave at first light, that I would not spend another hour in this place. But even as I tried to calm myself, a final sound reached my ears, a whisper, just behind me, too close to ignore. Morning came slowly, the sky a dull gray over the restless sea. I gathered my things quickly, refusing to look back at the lantern room as I descended the stairs. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift, as if the air itself had been holding its breath. The wreckage below remained unchanged, but I no longer needed to see it to know the truth. As I drove away, the lighthouse disappeared into the mist behind me. I told myself I would never return, but deep down I knew the past was not finished with that place. Whatever had happened that night, whatever force had turned the light, it had not been random. It had been waiting. And even now I could still feel its gaze watching from the shore. Story 21. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the road a thin, cracked ribbon beneath my tires. I had been driving for hours, my eyelids heavy, my body aching from the monotonous journey. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and I knew I needed to stop for the night. When I spotted a flickering neon sign reading Sundown Motel, I pulled into the dusty lot without hesitation. The building was small and weathered, its once white walls faded to a dull beige under the relentless sun. A single light buzzed above the entrance, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked pavement. Inside, the air smelled stale, a mix of dust and something faintly metallic. Behind the front desk sat an old man, his skin leathery and tanned, his milky eyes locking onto mine as I approached. "Need a room." His voice was dry, like sandpaper scraping against wood. I nodded, sliding my credit card across the counter, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he grabbed an old brass key from the wall behind him and set it on the counter with a dull clink. "Room 6, he said, his lips barely moving. "The man before you never checked out." A cold weight settled in my stomach, but I forced a chuckle. "You mean he left without paying?" I asked, but the clerk just shook his head. His gaze was unwavering, unreadable, and a long silence stretched between us. Finally, I grabbed the key, mumbled a thank you, and stepped back into the warm night air. The row of rooms stretched along the side of the building, their doors faded and chipped. Room 6 was near the middle, its door slightly warped from the heat. The key turned in the lock with a reluctant click, and I pushed inside, the air thick and stale. The single lamp on the nightstand bathed the room in dim, flickering light, revealing a bed with a stiff-looking blanket, a wooden chair, and a small TV mounted on the wall. I tossed my bag onto the bed, too exhausted to care about the musty smell that clung to the sheets. The room felt eerily still, the silence pressing against my ears like a held breath. I reached for the remote and turned on the TV, but the screen only flickered with static. With a sigh, I shut it off and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. The mirror was cracked along the edges, the silver backing peeling away in places. As I leaned over the sink, the fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, casting a bluish glow. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. There was something behind me, a shape in the mirror, barely visible in the dim light. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. I let out a shaky breath and rubbed my eyes, chalking it up to exhaustion. The desert heat had a way of messing with the mind, distorting reality like a mirage on the horizon. I turned off the bathroom light and climbed into bed, pulling the blanket over me despite the warmth. As I lay there, the mattress felt strangely lumpy, uneven, like something had been left beneath it. Shifting uncomfortably, I reached down and ran my hand along the edge, feeling something hard pressed against the fabric. My fingers closed around an object, and I pulled it free, a leather wallet, dry and cracked with age. My stomach twisted as I flipped it open, revealing an ID card with a faded photo. The name was illegible, but the picture sent a chill down my spine. It was the same man I had seen in the mirror. My pulse pounded as I dropped the wallet onto the nightstand, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I told myself it was a coincidence, that the Monell had probably rented this room dozens of times before. But the thought gnawed at me, digging into the back of my mind like a splinter. Why had the old man said the last guest never checked out? A soft creak echoed through the room, and I went rigid. It came from the chair near the window, the one I hadn't touched. My eyes darted to it, and my breath hitched. There was an indentation in the seat, as if someone were sitting there. The air around it seemed denser, a faint shimmer distorting the space. The temperature dropped, and my breath came out in a thin, misty cloud. A whisper drifted through the room, low and garbled, like a voice pressed against a radio static. My skin crawled as I strained to make out the words, but they dissolved into an eerie hush. I wanted to move, to run, but my limbs felt heavy, rooted to the mattress. Then, the bed dipped. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but I felt it shift in weight, as if something unseen had just sat beside me. The room pressed in, suffocating, the air thick with something unseen yet undeniably there. I clenched my fists, my heartbeat hammering in my ears, and then, just as suddenly as it came, the weight lifted. The silence stretched, unnatural and expectant, until the whisper returned, closer this time. A single word, rasping, desperate: run. I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the bed, grabbing my keys and yanking the door open with trembling hands. The night air hit me like a wave, but I barely registered it as I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the lock. As I shoved the key into the ignition, I stole a glance at the motel office. The old man stood in the window, watching. His expression was blank, unreadable, but something in his posture made my blood run cold. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't even seem concerned. It was as if he had been expecting this, expecting me to come running out like so many before me. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel kicking up in my wake. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, but I didn't dare slow down. The wallet still sat in the passenger seat, a silent reminder of the presence that had lingered in that room. Hours later, when I finally stopped for gas, I threw the wallet into a trash can, not daring to look inside again. As I stepped back into my car, my phone buzzed a new message, though I had no signal. My fingers shook as I unlocked the screen. Room 6 is waiting. Story 22. The battlefield stretched endlessly before me, its rolling hills and scattered monuments bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The air was still, carrying only the distant hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. I had always been fascinated by history, drawn to places where echoes of the past lingered. As I walked along the worn paths, I could almost imagine the thunder of cannons and the desperate cries of men locked in battle. I had planned this visit for weeks, eager to capture the solemn beauty of the historic site through my camera. Each monument told a story, etched with the names of soldiers who had perished on the very ground beneath my feet. I stopped at a weathered plaque, reading the details of a particularly brutal skirmish that had claimed hundreds of lives. A strange chill passed over me, despite the warmth of the day, making me shiver. Pulling out my camera, I framed the landscape before me, focusing on a ridge where some of the heaviest fighting had occurred. The view was haunting yet peaceful, the kind of shot that perfectly captured the weight of history. I snapped several pictures, adjusting the settings to ensure the lighting was just right. Satisfied, I lowered the camera and glanced around, realizing how quiet it had become. For a brief moment, I had the unsettling sensation that I was not alone. The feeling was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it had come. I shook it off and continued exploring, following a narrow trail that led to a line of ancient trees. The deeper I walked into the landscape, the stronger the sense of unease became, like unseen eyes watching from beyond the trees. I stopped at another marker, detailing the final moments of a regiment that had been surrounded and cut down. The words painted a gruesome picture, making me wonder what those last moments had been like. Lifting my camera again, I took another series of photos, capturing the long shadows stretching across the field. The eerie silence around me felt almost unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath. By the time I made my way back to my car, the sun had dipped lower, casting an amber glow across the battlefield. I reviewed the photos on my camera screen, flipping through each one to admire the crispness of the shots. That was when I saw a faint figure standing in the distance, right where I had taken the first picture. My breath caught in my throat as I zoomed in, my pulse quickening. There was no mistaking it. A group of shadowy figures stood along the ridge, their forms hazy but distinct. They looked like men, dressed in old military uniforms, their faces unreadable. My hands trembled as I flipped to the next photo, only to find them still there, unmoving, watching. But I had been alone, there was no one else in the field when I had taken those pictures. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I quickly glanced back toward the ridge. It was empty, just as it had been when I stood there minutes ago. My mind raced for a rational explanation, but none came. I checked my camera settings, wondering if there had been a glitch, but everything was normal. The figures were real, or at least they had been when I pressed the shutter. I hesitated, debating whether to go back and take another look. The logical part of me insisted that there had to be a reasonable explanation, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Something about that battlefield had held onto the past, refusing to let go. With a final uneasy glance toward the ridge, I got into my car and started the engine, the images still burned into my mind. That night, in my hotel room, I transferred the photos to my laptop, hoping the larger screen would provide some clarity. The figures were even clearer now, standing in formation as if waiting for orders. Some faced the camera directly, while others appeared turned toward an unseen force. Their presence was undeniable, chilling in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. I spent hours researching similar occurrences, finding countless stories of visitors capturing ghostly apparitions on historic battlefields. Many claimed the land was imprinted with the memories of the fallen, replaying moments of their final stand. Others believed the spirits of soldiers lingered, still bound to the place where they had died. The more I read, the more certain I became that I had witnessed something beyond explanation. Sleep didn't come easily that night, my mind replaying the moment I had felt watched. Every creak of the hotel's old pipes made me jump, and I kept glancing at my laptop screen as if the figures might move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep filled with dreams of distant gunfire and faceless soldiers. The next morning, I debated returning to the battlefield, but the thought unsettled me. Instead, I decided to visit the local historical society, hoping to learn more about the area's past. The curator, an elderly man with a knowing expression, listened intently as I described what I had captured. He nodded, as if my experience was neither strange nor unexpected. "You're not the first to see them," he said, folding his hands over the desk. "Many who visit that ridge leave with more than they bargained for. Some say the soldiers don't realize they've died. Others believe they're waiting for a battle that never ends." His words sent a shiver down my spine, confirming what I already suspected. As I left the historical society, I felt the weight of the past pressing against me. The battlefield had given me a glimpse of something few had seen, a moment frozen in time beyond the grasp of the living. Though I couldn't explain it, I knew one thing for certain: I had not been alone out there. The soldiers still stood where they had fallen, waiting, watching, never truly gone. Story 23. The streets were empty as I wandered through the quiet part of town, my footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. Most of the buildings were abandoned, their windows dark, their signs faded with age. I should have turned back, but something about the stillness made me keep walking. That was when I saw the theater, its marquee flickering with the words "Midnight" showing one night only. The building looked ancient, its Art Deco design still intact despite the years of neglect. The glass doors were streaked with dust, yet the golden handles gleamed as if they had just been polished. A faint glow seeped from inside, casting a pale light onto the sidewalk. I hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open, stepping into the cool, dimly lit lobby. The scent of old popcorn and dust hung heavy in the air, the carpet beneath my feet warm but plush. The concession stand stood empty, its display case filled with candy boxes that looked decades old. A single attendant stood behind the counter, motionless, their uniform crisp and outdated. Their face was shadowed, their posture unnervingly stiff as they wordlessly pointed toward the entrance of the theater. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by the thick red carpet. The auditorium was massive, lined with rows of velvet seats that stretched into darkness. The screen at the front flickered with static, sending ghostly light across the room. My breath caught when I looked at the audience, a sea of unmoving figures filling nearly every seat. They were not people, at least not anymore. Some looked like mannequins, their plastic skin reflecting the pale glow of the screen. Others were more grotesque, shadowy shapes slouched unnaturally, their forms blurred as if they existed between this world and something else. A few had faces frozen in expressions of terror, their glassy eyes locked onto the flickering screen. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, drawn deeper into the unsettling scene. The silence was suffocating, the air thick with something unnameable. I took a seat near the back, my body tense, my mind screaming at me to leave. But the moment I sat down, the lights dimmed, and the film began to play. The screen showed a black and white movie, grainy and silent, the film crackling as it rolled. It took me a moment to recognize the setting: a theater, eerily similar to the one I sat in. The camera panned over the audience, revealing row after row of figures just like the ones around me. My pulse pounded as I realized the film was showing this exact moment, playing out in real time. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to see if anyone else reacted, but the audience remained still. On screen, the camera zoomed in on a lone figure sitting in the back row. My breath caught as I recognized myself, every detail perfectly mirrored. The filmie looked directly at the screen, wide-eyed, frozen in horror. A shuffling sound came from somewhere in the theater, low and deliberate. I turned my head slowly, my hands gripping the armrests. The figures in the seats were no longer still. Their heads twitched, their bodies shifting, their lifeless eyes now locked onto me. A strangled breath left my lips as the nearest ones began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. The film on the screen flickered, and I saw myself stand up in my seat. My real body refused to move, paralyzed by fear as I watched my own image turn toward the aisle. In the film, I ran, pushing past the figures, sprinting for the exit. My heart pounded as I forced myself to do the same, shoving myself out of the seat. The figures moved faster now, their limbs stretching in ways that defied logic. They reached for me, their fingers grazing my arms as I bolted toward the doors. The film continued to play, mirroring my every movement, the distorted version of myself running in perfect sync. I crashed into the lobby, my breath ragged, the attendant still standing motionless behind the counter. I didn't stop running until I burst through the front doors, the cold night air slamming into me. My lungs burned as I stumbled onto the sidewalk, my legs weak beneath me. I turned back to look at the theater, my heart hammering against my ribs. The marquee was dark now, the building lifeless, the entrance sealed shut. The street was silent, no sign of the glowing light that had drawn me in. I took a step back, my body trembling, my mind racing. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I yanked it out with shaking hands. The screen was black, except for one notification, a video file labeled "Midnight Showing." I stared at it, my fingers numb, dread creeping into my bones. The thumbnail was a single frame from the film, my own terrified face staring back at me. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. I already knew how the story ended. Story 24. The Victorian house stood at the end of a long, cracked driveway, its once grand facade now worn and faded. The town's historical society had recruited volunteers to restore it, hoping to turn it into a museum. I had always been fascinated by old homes, their history woven into the wood and stone. Stepping onto the porch, I felt an odd weight in the air, as if the house itself was watching. Inside, dust coated every surface, and the scent of aged wood and mildew filled the air. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing layers of different designs from over the decades. Most of the rooms had furniture covered in white sheets, their ghostly forms frozen in time. The grand staircase curved upward, its banisters smooth and worn from years of use. I had been assigned to clear out one of the upstairs bedrooms, a task I thought would be simple. The moment I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Every piece of furniture, the bed, the dresser, the chairs, was nailed to the ceiling, as if gravity had reversed in this one room. The sight made my stomach twist, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The bed's ornate wooden frame clung to the ceiling, its mattress pressed against it as if someone had once slept there upside down. A rocking chair hung eerily still, despite the faint breeze from the hallway. The dresser, complete with its mirror, reflected the room from its unnatural position. Dust had settled on everything, undisturbed, as if it had been this way for years. I stepped inside cautiously, my boots making soft impressions in the thick dust on the floor. The air felt heavier in this room, thick and unmoving, like it had been trapped for decades. I reached up, running my fingers along the edge of the dresser's drawer, testing to see if it would budge. The nails were driven deep, keeping everything firmly in place. A shiver ran down my spine as I tried to make sense of it. Had someone done this as a prank, or was there a reason for it? The house had belonged to the Whitmore family, a wealthy but reclusive couple who had lived here over a century ago. Rumors whispered that their only son had been troubled, but no one knew what had really happened to him. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the furniture, something about this room felt wrong. The wallpaper was a different pattern than the rest of the house, its floral design faded but oddly untouched by time. In the far corner, a small wooden toy lay abandoned on the floor, the only thing not defying gravity. I bent down, picking it up, my fingers brushing against the smooth, carved wood. It was a spinning top, the kind a child might have played with long ago. As soon as I touched it, the air in the room seemed to shift like a breath exhaled from unseen lips. The floor creaked behind me, though I was the only one there. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest. The door remained open, the hallway empty beyond it. I was certain I had heard something, a whisper of movement where there should have been none. My grip on the spinning top tightened as I forced myself to breathe evenly. Deciding I had seen enough, I placed the top back on the floor and turned to leave. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, a sound echoed through the room, a slow, deliberate creaking. I glanced back, my pulse spiking as I saw the rocking chair moving, its motion subtle but undeniable. Panic gripped me as I stepped back into the hall, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came fast, my skin cold with unease. I wanted to believe it was just the draft, just the old wood settling, but deep down I knew better. Something in that room was watching. I hurried downstairs, finding the project coordinator, an older woman named Margaret, sorting through a pile of antique books. I hesitated before asking her about the room, uncertain how much I wanted to know. When I finally mentioned it, her face paled, her hand stilling over the pages. "You went in there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When I nodded, she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. That was the boy's room. The Whitmore's son. He wasn't well. She hesitated, as if debating how much to tell me. He used to tell his parents the room wasn't right, she continued. Said everything felt backwards, like he was standing on the wrong side of the world. They dismissed it as childish nonsense, until one morning they found him sitting on the ceiling. My breath caught, my mind rejecting the image, but Margaret's expression was grim. They tried everything, doctors, priests, but he kept insisting that the room wanted him. Then, one night, he disappeared. They never found a trace of him. She looked away, her voice softer. The furniture was already nailed to the ceiling when they found the empty room. A chill settled deep in my bones as her words sank in. The house had stood empty for decades after that, abandoned by the Whitmores, left to decay. Now, as we attempted to restore it, we were stirring whatever had been left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying everything I had seen. The upside-down furniture, the abandoned spinning top, the slow movement of the rocking chair. I kept telling myself it was just an old house, just a trick of the mind, but doubt clawed at me. The next morning I arrived at the house early, determined to check the room one last time. When I reached the door, I hesitated before pushing it open. My stomach lurched at what I saw. The furniture was back on the floor, perfectly arranged, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The bed, the dresser, the rocking chair, all in their proper places. untouched by dust. Only one thing remained out of place. The spinning top sat in the center of the room, still spinning. Story 25. The church stood at the edge of town, long abandoned and forgotten by most. Its wooden doors hung slightly open, revealing the darkness inside, as if inviting me to step in. I had heard the stories, tales of strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, but curiosity outweighed my fear. Pushing the doors wider, I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the empty nave. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and decay filling my lungs. Rows of pews stretched before me, their once polished surfaces now splintered and worn. Stained glass windows, cracked and faded, still clung to their haunting beauty, casting distorted colors onto the cold stone floor. Despite the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved deeper into the church, my footsteps careful on the uneven ground. The altar stood untouched, a massive wooden cross hanging above it, its edges blackened with age. Cobwebs clung to the pulpit, swaying slightly despite the still air. Somewhere in the distance, a faint creaking sound broke the silence, like someone shifting their weight. I turned toward the confession booths lining the side of the nave, their doors slightly ajar. The wood was warped, the deep carving still visible despite years of neglect. As I neared, my breath caught in my throat. One of the booths was dimly lit from within. A single candle flickered inside, its flame steady, casting long shadows against the walls. The sight sent a chill down my spine. There was no reason for a candle to be burning here. No one had been inside for years, or so I thought. The melted wax dripped slowly, fresh and warm, proof that it had been lit recently. My pulse quickened as I hesitated, torn between stepping closer and turning away. A whisper brushed against my ear, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. "Leave now." The voice was neither angry nor urgent, but the words carried weight, pressing into my chest. My breath turned shallow as I spun around, scanning the empty church for any sign of movement. The pews remained still, the air unmoving, yet the presence was undeniable. The candle's flame wavered, as if disturbed by an unseen breath. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to listen to the warning. But curiosity had always been my downfall, and I couldn't help but reach for the confession booth's door. As my fingers brushed the aged wood, a deep groan echoed through the church, the sound of something shifting above me. I jerked my hand away, glancing toward the rafters where the ceiling loomed in darkness. The groan faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness, as if the entire building was waiting for my next move. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to breathe, every nerve in my body on edge. Stepping back, I decided to leave, my curiosity no longer worth the growing unease clawing at my senses. But as I turned toward the exit, the candle's flame suddenly snuffed out, plunging the booth into darkness. My body tensed, a cold dread washing over me, making my limbs feel heavy and sluggish. Then, from the depths of the booth, came a slow, deliberate breath. It was deep and rattling, as if someone were sitting just beyond the threshold, unseen but undeniably present. My legs felt rooted in place, fear wrapping around me like a vice. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching long enough for me to feel the weight of eyes on my back. Forcing my feet to move, I stumbled toward the exit, each step feeling like a battle against something unseen. The air pressed against me, thick and oppressive, as if the very church was unwilling to let me go. The wooden doors loomed ahead, but just as I reached them, a loud crash erupted behind me, sending a jolt of terror through my spine. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but the church remained empty. The pews stood undisturbed, the altar unchanged, yet I knew something had moved. The confession booth door now hung open, revealing only darkness within. But I swore I saw the faintest outline of a figure shifting inside. A deep sense of wrongness settled in my gut, urging me to leave before it was too late. I pushed through the heavy doors, the night air rushing over me like a breath of relief. The weight on my chest lifted slightly, but as I turned to look back, my blood ran cold. The candle inside the booth had been relit, its flame burning steady once more. I didn't wait to see if anything else would happen. My feet carried me down the broken stone steps, across the overgrown path, and back toward the safety of the town. Even as I put distance between myself and the church, the whisper echoed in my mind, as clear as if it had been spoken only moments ago. Leave now. Sleep did not come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flickering candle, heard the breath from within the booth. The presence in that church had been real, something beyond explanation, beyond logic. It had not wanted me there, and I had no intention of returning. Days passed, but the unease lingered, a shadow at the back of my thoughts. I tried to convince myself that my mind had played tricks on me, that the candle had been left behind by another trespasser. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been waiting in that church, and it had made sure I knew I was not welcome. I drove past the church one final time, unable to resist one last glance. The wooden doors were closed now, appearing as they always had, untouched and forgotten. But as I slowed the car, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a dim glow within the booth, burning steadily in the darkness. The candle had been lit again. Story 26. The ghost town was exactly as I had hoped, silent, forgotten, and eerily beautiful. The buildings, their wooden frames weathered by time, stood like skeletons of a long-lost era. I parked my car at the edge of what used to be the main road, grabbing my camera and stepping onto the dusty ground. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the abandoned streets. I walked slowly, taking in the crumbling storefronts and the rusted remains of an old wagon. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and decay, and the only sounds were the occasional gusts of wind rattling loose boards. Lifting my camera, I framed a shot of the old saloon, its windows dark and hollow. I clicked the shutter, already imagining the haunting beauty of the final image. Moving further into town, I captured more buildings: the schoolhouse, the general store, a row of small homes with peeling paint. The ghost town had an undeniable presence, as if the past still lingered just beneath the surface. I reviewed a few shots on my camera, admiring the way the light played off the abandoned structures. But something caught my eye, making me pause. In the last photo I had taken of the saloon, a figure stood in the upstairs window. My heart stuttered as I zoomed in, seeing the pale shape of a person staring directly at me. The details were indistinct, but the outline was unmistakable: a head, shoulders, dark hollows where eyes should be. I spun around, my pulse pounding, but the window was empty. A cold unease settled over me as I scanned the buildings, searching for any sign of movement. There was no one here. I had driven miles off the main road, past rusted signs and broken fences, into a place no one visited. Taking a deep breath, I convinced myself it was an illusion, maybe a trick of the light, or an old poster peeling from the wall. Determined to shake the feeling, I continued my shoot, capturing more of the town's eerie charm. The post office, with its broken glass door, made for a striking image, and I took several shots before moving on. Reviewing them on my screen, my stomach dropped. In each photo, a figure stood inside the building, peering out from the shattered doorway. I swore under my breath, spinning to look at the post office. Empty. The sun glared down, the town as lifeless as before. But the images on my camera told a different story. My hands felt clammy as I scrolled through more pictures, my breath hitching with each new discovery. The general store's window had a face in it. The schoolhouse had a shadow in the doorway. Every single photo had someone or something watching me. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters of the buildings, making them groan like they were shifting under invisible weight. I didn't believe in ghosts, but my body told a different story. My skin prickled, my heartbeat thrummed in my ears. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had followed me here. Maybe this was some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew I was alone. I considered leaving, but my stubborn curiosity won out. I had come here for haunting images, and that was exactly what I had found. Steeling myself, I lifted my camera again, turning toward the largest building in town, the old hotel. Its wooden sign hung crookedly above the entrance, barely legible beneath layers of dust and time. I focused on the second floor, pressing the shutter. The moment I took the photo, something moved behind the curtains. I lowered my camera, my breath catching as the fabric shifted, as if someone had just stepped away from the window. My pulse pounded as I stepped closer, hesitating at the base of the rotting stairs leading up to the front door. I told myself to leave, to turn around and drive away, but instead, I placed my hand on the door and pushed. The inside of the hotel smelled of damp wood and time. Dust coated every surface, floating in the golden light that streamed through cracked windows. The lobby was still, the furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I moved toward the staircase, my camera clutched tightly in my hands. The second-floor hallway stretched before me, lined with open doors that revealed rooms frozen in decay. The air felt heavier here, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I hesitated at one door, drawn to the dark space beyond. Lifting my camera, I snapped a photo into the room before stepping inside. The bed was unmade, its sheets brittle with age. A dresser stood against the far wall, its mirror so clouded I could barely see my reflection. I turned to leave, but as I did, something flickered in the mirror's surface. A shape, a person standing directly behind me. I spun, heart hammering, but the room was empty. My breath came fast and shallow as I forced myself to check the mirror again. Nothing. My hands trembled as I lifted my camera to review the picture I had just taken. My stomach turned cold. There in the reflection was the figure I had seen standing behind me, watching. That was it. I was done. Shoving my camera into my bag, I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my rush to escape. The hotel groaned behind me as I stumbled outside, my car only steps away. As I yanked open the door, I dared one last glance back at the town. Every window, every doorway, every shadowed corner figure stood there, unmoving, watching me leave. My fingers fumbled with the keys and I barely got the engine started before peeling away from the ghost town. The dirt road blurred beneath my tires as I sped away, my body cold despite the heat. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, my hands still shaking as I pulled into the parking lot. Inside the car, I hesitated before looking at my camera again. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but I couldn't bring myself to erase the proof of what I had seen. I uploaded the photos that night, half expecting the figures to be gone. They weren't. They remained in every shot, standing where I had seen them, their hollow eyes fixed on the camera. I haven't returned to that town since, but sometimes late at night, I swear I see those faces again in reflections, in windows, in the dark corners of my room. Watching. Story 27. The inn sat at the edge of a quiet town, its old brick walls covered in ivy, its wooden sign creaking softly in the breeze. I had driven for hours and wanted nothing more than a hot meal and a good night's rest. The lobby smelled of aged wood and something faintly floral, like dried roses left too long in a vase. A woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite but distant smile, sliding the guest book toward me. The leather-bound book was worn, its pages yellowed and frayed at the edges. As I flipped through, I noticed the dates stretched back over a century, each page filled with careful signatures. Some names had tiny symbols beside them, an old-fashioned cross or a small note scribbled in faded ink. I paused when I reached the last page, my breath catching as I saw my name already written there. For a moment I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe another guest with the same name. But the ink was fresh, the letters identical to my own handwriting. My stomach tightened as I glanced at the woman behind the desk, but she was busy straightening a pile of brochures, acting as if nothing was unusual. My fingers hovered over the pen before I finally signed below my name, the ink sinking too easily into the old paper. She handed me a brass key with a small tag labeled Room 206 and gestured toward the grand staircase. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, the hallways dimly lit by antique sconces casting flickering shadows on the wallpaper. Everything about the place felt heavy, like the walls held too many secrets, the air thick with stories never told aloud. My room was at the end of the hall, its door fitting too snugly in the frame, as if it hadn't been opened in years. The inside was quaint, an antique bed, a worn armchair by the window, and a vanity with a clouded mirror. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something cold and metallic. I set my bag down and moved to the window, looking out over the quiet street below. The lights in the town flickered, and for a second, I swore I saw a figure standing just outside the inn staring up at my window. A sudden knock at my door made me jump, my pulse quickening. I hesitated before opening it, expecting to see the woman from the front desk, but the hallway was empty. The floorboards creaked as if someone had just stepped away, but no one was there. I shut the door quickly, locking it before stepping back toward the bed, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. Lying down, I tried to ignore the strange feeling that lingered in the room, but sleep didn't come easily. The walls seemed to breathe, the air shifting subtly, the temperature dropping by degrees. Just as I was about to drift off, the mattress dipped beside me, as if someone had just sat down. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place, too afraid to turn my head. A whisper slid through the silence, low and breathy, my name drawn out like a sigh. My entire body went cold, my fingers gripping the blanket as I forced myself to sit up. The room was empty, but the air was charged, heavy with something unseen. I fumbled for the lamp, my hands shaking as warm light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows that felt too thick, too alive. I didn't sleep after that, lying still and waiting for the first slivers of dawn to break through the window. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things, determined to check out as quickly as possible. But when I went downstairs, the front desk was empty, the guest book open to the last page. My name was still there, but now beside it was a tiny cross in black ink. A cold dread settled in my chest as I reached out to touch the page, my fingertips smudging the ink slightly. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing in on me as if the inn itself was waiting for something. I turned quickly, heading for the front door, but the moment my hand touched the knob, a voice whispered from behind me, "You can't leave yet." I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but the lobby was empty. The silence stretched, too thick, too deep, like the very walls were listening. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and stepping into the bright morning light, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The town outside looked unchanged, peaceful, unaware of the weight pressing against my chest. I hurried to my car, throwing my bag into the passenger seat before glancing up at the inn one last time. A figure stood in the window of room 206, barely visible through the sheer curtains. It wasn't me. The shadow lingered for a moment before fading, dissolving into the light like a breath against glass. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I turned the key, my only thought to get as far away as possible. The road stretched ahead, the town shrinking in my rearview mirror, but the unease didn't fade. My name was still in that book, marked like all the others who had come before me. The thought curled in my mind, settling deep like a splinter I couldn't pull out. As the miles passed, a single question burned in my mind. If all the other names belonged to people who had died there, then what did that mean for me? Story 28. The trail leading through the old mining area was overgrown, the remnants of wooden beams and rusted rail tracks peeking through the dirt. I had heard stories about the abandoned shafts and the dangers of wandering too close, but curiosity had always been my weakness. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. A faint breeze carried the scent of earth and decay, whispering through the skeletal remains of forgotten structures. As I moved deeper into the area, I spotted a small shack nestled against the base of a hill. The wood was warped and weathered, its roof partially caved in, but something about it felt strangely untouched. I stepped closer, noticing that the door was slightly ajar, revealing the darkness within. A faint glint caught my eye. Rows of old lanterns lined the walls, their glass surfaces reflecting the dim light filtering through the gaps in the wood. I hesitated at the threshold, my fingers brushing against the splintered frame. The air inside was thick with dust, carrying the scent of oil and rusted metal. Stepping cautiously inside, I ran my fingers along one of the lanterns, surprised that the glass wasn't as grimy as I had expected. The moment my foot crossed fully into the room, a soft click echoed through the space, followed by a sudden burst of light. Every lantern in the shack flared to life, their flames flickering in perfect unison. The glow bathed the room in a warm, golden light, casting shifting shadows along the walls. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. There were no wires, no switches, and certainly no reason for oil lanterns to ignite on their own. A chill ran down my spine despite the heat radiating from the flames. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the doorway remained empty. The only sound was the soft crackle of the lanterns, burning as if they had been waiting for someone to arrive. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took another step, watching the firelight dance along the wooden beams. I reached for the nearest lantern, expecting the glass to be hot, but it was cool beneath my fingertips. The wick burned steadily, yet there was no sensation of heat, no scent of oil burning. The unnatural stillness of the flames made my stomach twist with unease. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing in around me. A sudden gust of wind rattled the walls, but the flames didn't flicker or waver. It was as if they weren't reacting to the world around them at all. The silence grew oppressive, thick with something I couldn't name. I backed toward the door, my movements slow and deliberate, my instincts screaming that I was no longer alone. Just as I reached the doorway, a sound broke through the hush, a low, rhythmic tapping, like boots on wood. It came from beneath me, as if someone were walking just below the floorboards. My breath hitched as I scanned the shack, but there was no trapdoor, no basement, nothing but solid earth beneath the wooden planks. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the small space. The lanterns flickered, their flames flaring higher for a brief moment before settling again. The tapping stopped just as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a suffocating stillness. My skin prickled as an icy sensation crawled up my spine. Something was waiting, watching, unseen but undeniably there. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. Turning sharply, I bolted out of the shack, my boots kicking up dust as I stumbled onto the uneven ground. The moment I crossed the threshold, the lanterns winked out all at once, plunging the shack into darkness. My chest heaved as I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shack stood silent, its interior shrouded in shadow, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. My skin still tingled with the lingering sensation of being watched, the memory of the tapping still fresh in my ears. I took another step back, unwilling to turn my back completely on whatever presence lingered within. The wind howled through the valley, stirring the dust around my feet. In the fading light, the landscape seemed even more desolate, as if it had swallowed whatever remnants of life once existed here. I forced myself to move, my legs unsteady as I retraced my steps back toward the trail. Every instinct told me to leave this place behind, to never return. As I climbed the path leading away from the mining site, I cast one last glance over my shoulder. The shack stood motionless against the hill, its weathered boards blending into the rugged terrain. But just as I turned away, a flicker of light caught my eye, a single lantern glowing dimly in the darkness. It pulsed once, then faded, leaving behind nothing but the eerie silence of the abandoned land. Story 29. The motel had been abandoned for years, its once vibrant sign now rusted and unreadable. The owners had hired a crew to restore it, hoping to turn it into something profitable again. The place was in bad shape, with peeling wallpaper, warped floorboards, and a thick layer of dust coating everything. I had taken the job for the paycheck, not expecting much beyond hard labor and the occasional dead rat in the walls. We started in the lobby, tearing down old paneling and replacing broken fixtures. The history of the place was evident in every faded photograph and rusted key left behind. It had been a roadside stop for travelers once, but something about it felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, like the walls held secrets no one wanted to uncover. I was working in one of the old rooms when I noticed something odd about the back wall. The measurements didn't match the blueprints, and a hollow sound echoed when I knocked against it. The other guys were on a break, so I grabbed a crowbar and started prying at the edges. The drywall crumbled easily, revealing a hidden space beyond it. Dust billowed out as I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick and stale, untouched for years. My pulse quickened when I saw what lay inside. There were suitcases stacked haphazardly, wallets scattered across the floor, and a row of car keys hanging from nails in the wall. Each suitcase was old, their leather cracked and discolored. I hesitated before reaching for one, my fingers brushing against the worn handle. It was heavy, stuffed with clothes, personal belongings, and faded photographs. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these had been left here, abandoned. The wallets were worse. Some still had IDs inside, the faces staring back at me frozen in time. They belonged to men and women of all ages, their names long forgotten. My hands shook as I flipped through them, each one raising more questions than the last. The car keys gleamed under the beam of my flashlight, their tags still attached. Some of the brands were unfamiliar, models that hadn't been made in decades. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I did the math. These weren't just lost items. These belonged to people who had never checked out. I stepped back, my breathing uneven. There was no dust on the suitcases, no cobwebs on the wallets. Someone had been in here more recently than I wanted to believe. The thought made my skin crawl. Who had hidden this room? And why? A noise from outside made me freeze. It was faint, a soft creak like footsteps in the hallway. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening. The other guys were still outside, smoking near the trucks. Whoever was out there wasn't part of the crew. The floorboards groaned again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I eased toward the opening, peeking out just enough to see into the dimly lit room beyond. A shadow moved past the doorway, slow and deliberate. Someone was here. I forced myself to stay still, my mind racing. If they knew I had found the room, I wasn't sure what they would do. The motel had been abandoned for years, but someone had a reason to keep this hidden. I had a feeling they wouldn't be happy about me poking around. The footsteps faded, disappearing down the hall. I waited a moment longer before slipping out, careful to stay quiet. My hands were clammy, adrenaline making my legs feel weak. I needed to get out to tell someone about what I had found. I made it outside without looking back, my breath coming in quick bursts. The crew was still near the trucks, laughing and unaware of what I had just uncovered. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. If I told them, would they believe me? Instead, I walked straight to my car and grabbed my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to call the police. If I reported it, they would have to investigate, and whatever had happened here would finally come to light. But a part of me feared what they would find. I took a deep breath and dialed. The dispatcher listened as I explained, her tone shifting when I mentioned the suitcases and wallets. She told me to stay put, that officers were on their way. I hung up, my hand still shaking. The wait felt endless. My eyes kept drifting toward the motel, half expecting to see movement in the windows. The place loomed in the fading daylight, its darkened rooms hiding more than just dust and decay. When the police arrived, they took my statement and followed me inside. The hidden room was just as I had left it, the air still heavy with its secrets. One of the officers pulled out an old ID from a wallet, his expression darkening as he read the name. "This guy's been missing since 1978, he muttered. The other officer picked up a suitcase, flipping it open. A faded airline tag showed a destination that no one had ever reached. More officers arrived, taping off the area as they began collecting evidence. I stood outside, watching as they carried out the items one by one. The weight of what I had found settled on me like a stone. Over the next few days, the news spread. The motel had been linked to a string of disappearances spanning decades. Some of the missing had last been seen checking in, but their checkout records never existed. The original owner had vanished years ago, leaving the place to fall into disrepair. I never found out exactly what had happened in that room. The police kept details quiet, though rumors swirled. Some said it had been a dumping ground, a place where people were lured and never seen again. Others believed someone had been watching all along, waiting for the right moment to hide the past once more. I quit the renovation job soon after. There was no amount of money that could make me step foot in that place again. The motel remained abandoned, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. But sometimes I still dream about it. In those dreams, I'm back in that hidden room, surrounded by lost belongings and silent ghosts. The air is thick, suffocating, and I can hear footsteps just beyond the wall. They're slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Story 30. The storage facility was just outside of town. A long row of identical metal doors stretching under the glow of flickering overhead lights. The manager was an older man with a tired expression, handing me the key without much conversation. The unit was near the end of the lot, its lock rusted but still functional. I slid the key in, turned it, and pulled the door open, expecting an empty space. Instead, I was met with the sight of stacked boxes, old furniture, and dust-covered belongings. A wooden dresser stood against the back wall, its drawers slightly open as if someone had left in a hurry. A pile of newspapers sat on the floor, the edges curled and yellowed with age. I hesitated, wondering if there had been a mistake, but my name was clearly written on the rental agreement. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of mildew and time. The light from outside barely reached past the doorway, casting long shadows over the forgotten items. I ran a hand over an old trunk, its leather surface worn and cracked. Curiosity gnawed at me as I knelt to open one of the boxes, my fingers brushing against something brittle and thin. Inside were faded photographs, their edges curling from years of neglect. They depicted a family, a man, a woman, and a little boy standing in front of a house with peeling paint. Their expressions were solemn, their eyes oddly vacant, as if they had been caught mid-thought. I flipped through more pictures, each one capturing fragments of a lifelong past. A creaking sound made me freeze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing at the entrance, but the lot was empty. The wind had picked up, rattling the metal doors along the row, but the air inside remained still. I pushed the unease aside and grabbed a newspaper from the pile, brushing off the dust. The date read October 3rd, 1994. My stomach twisted as I realized the pages hadn't been disturbed in years. I flipped through the brittle sheets, my eyes scanning the headlines. There, on the third page, was a grainy black and white photo of the same family from the pictures. The headline sent a chill down my spine: local family missing, house left untouched. I swallowed hard, my hands tightening around the paper. The article detailed how the family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind their home, their belongings, and no signs of a struggle. Neighbors had reported seeing them the night before, but by morning they were gone. The police had investigated, but no leads ever surfaced. I stood up quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had rented this unit years ago and never cleaned it out. Maybe the manager had simply forgotten. I needed answers, so I locked the unit back up and walked straight to the front office. The manager barely looked up as I entered, but when I mentioned the full unit, his expression shifted. His brow furrowed, and he rubbed his chin as if trying to recall something. "That unit's been empty for 10 years, he finally said, his voice low. My skin prickled at the certainty in his tone. I told him that wasn't possible, that the unit was filled with old furniture, photos, and boxes. He frowned and pulled a thick binder from the desk, flipping through records with slow, deliberate movements. "Last person who rented it never came back," he muttered, tapping a page. "No payments, no visits, nothing. We cleaned it out a decade ago." My mouth felt dry as I stared at the paper. It confirmed what he said: the unit had been abandoned for years. But I had just seen it, filled with someone's life, frozen in time. My mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. I insisted he come with me to check, my urgency making him sigh before grabbing his keys. Together, we walked back to the unit, the lot eerily silent except for the crunch of gravel underfoot. When we reached the door, I hesitated before unlocking it again, my heart pounding. I swung the door open, expecting to see the cluttered space just as I had left it. But inside, the unit was completely empty. The concrete floor was bare, the walls unmarked by dust or signs of storage. My breath hitched as I stepped inside, my eyes darting around for any trace of what I had seen before. The manager gave me a strange look, crossing his arms. "Like I said, empty," he muttered, turning back toward the office. I remained frozen in place, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. I had held those photos, read that newspaper. They had been real. I walked out slowly, locking the unit once more, my hands trembling. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just inside the doorway, where the concrete met the gravel, lay a single photograph. I bent down, picking it up with careful fingers. It was the same family, standing in front of their house, their expressions unchanged. But this time there was something different. In the window behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was the faint outline of a figure watching from inside. A cold shudder ran through me as I flipped the photo over. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Still here." My breath came in short gasps, and I dropped the photo, stepping back quickly. The storage lot suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I hurried to my car, throwing the key onto the passenger seat, my pulse hammering. As I pulled out onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the rows of silent, locked doors. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a whisper I couldn't quite hear. That night I lay awake, the memory of the storage unit gnawing at my mind. The images, the belongings, the newspaper, where had they gone? And why had I been the one to see them? I thought about the missing family, about their house, their disappearance. Sleep never came, only the restless weight of unanswered questions. Somewhere, in the quiet hours before dawn, I made a decision. I would never return to that storage unit. Whatever had been waiting inside, whatever had wanted to be found, had left me with only one message. Still here.